Control your emotions and stop reacting. This audiobook reveals the transformative power of mastering your emotions and reclaiming control over your life. You'll discover the secret to breaking free from the cycle of reactive behavior and stepping into a life of conscious choice. The tools you're about to learn will not only change how you respond to challenges, but will shape who you become. Introduction. Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night, replaying that moment when your emotions got the better of you? That heated exchange with your colleague, the burst of frustration with your child, or the anxiety that paralyzed you during a crucial presentation. You're not alone. In fact, research shows that 75% of professionals report that emotional reactions have negatively impacted their work performance in the past year. Our emotional responses shape every aspect of our lives, from our relationships to our careers. Yet most of us were never taught how to effectively manage them. We operate on autopilot, letting our primitive brain's fight-or-flight response dictate our behavior in moments that matter most. I knew a guy named David, a talented marketing manager at a Fortune 500 company. Despite his innovative ideas and technical expertise, David's inability to regulate his emotional reactions was sabotaging his potential. During one particularly stressful product launch, his impulsive outburst in a stakeholder meeting nearly cost him his job. His marriage was suffering too. Minor disagreements with his wife would escalate into day-long conflicts, leaving both feeling hurt and misunderstood. "I felt like a passenger in my own life," David admitted. "I knew I needed to change, but breathing exercises and counting to 10 weren't cutting it. I needed something more fundamental." This brings us to a crucial understanding. Your emotions aren't the enemy. They're sophisticated information systems designed to help you navigate life. The problem isn't that you feel intensely, it's that you haven't yet mastered the art of choosing your response. Michelle Obama's journey provides a powerful illustration of this principle. Long before she became First Lady, she faced intense scrutiny and criticism that would have derailed many. In her memoir, Becoming, she shares a pivotal realization. "I spent years learning that the key to dignity wasn't in how others treated me, but in how I chose to respond. This wasn't just about staying calm. It was about developing a new relationship with my emotions entirely." She later revealed in a 2018 interview, "I used to react immediately to every slight, every feeling of being undervalued. It was exhausting and ineffective. Everything changed when I learned to create space between the trigger and my response. That's when they go low, we go high, became more than a saying. It became my operating system." This book introduces the response gap method, a revolutionary approach that goes beyond traditional emotional management techniques. This isn't another collection of quick fixes or temporary coping mechanisms. Instead, you'll discover a science-backed system for rewiring your emotional responses at a neural level, creating lasting change that becomes stronger with every challenge you face. Through this audiobook, you'll learn how successful leaders, athletes, and innovators have used these principles to maintain composure under extreme pressure. You'll discover why willpower alone isn't enough and how to build a sustainable foundation for emotional mastery. From CEOs making billion-dollar decisions to parents navigating teenage defiance, these strategies have transformed thousands of lives. The fact that you're reading these words shows remarkable self-awareness and courage. You've already taken the first step, recognizing that there's a better way to handle life's emotional challenges. This acknowledgement puts you ahead of 90% of people who continue to let their reactions control their lives. In the chapters ahead, you'll discover how to create an unshakable foundation of emotional awareness, the neuroscience behind triggered responses and how to rewire them, practical tools for maintaining composure in any situation, strategies for turning emotional triggers into catalysts for growth. You're about to embark on a transformative journey that has already changed countless lives. The strategies you'll learn aren't just theories. They're battle-tested tools that have helped people just like you reclaim control of their emotional responses and, by extension, their lives. Remember, by picking up this book, you've already demonstrated the courage to change. Now, let's transform that courage into mastery. Your journey to emotional freedom begins here. Chapter 1. The hidden cost of reaction. The kitchen of Le Petit Jardin buzzed with its usual dinner service intensity. Steam rose from simmering pots, flames leaped beneath copper pans, and the rhythmic chopping of knives created the familiar percussion of fine dining preparation. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Miguel Ramirez, executive chef and culinary virtuoso, whose reputation for brilliant dishes was matched only by his volcanic temper. "Service!" called out the expeditor, sliding 2 perfectly plated entrees onto the pass. As Miguel turned to inspect them, a new line cook rushing past knocked into a server. Time seemed to slow as the plate tilted, then fell, shattering against the floor in a spray of porcelain and carefully crafted cuisine. The kitchen fell silent. Every staff member froze, eyes darting between the broken dish and their chef, knowing all too well what typically came next. Miguel felt the familiar surge of rage rising in his chest. His face flushed hot, jaw clenching as the pressure built behind his eyes. Just last week, a similar incident had ended with him throwing his apron down and storming out mid-service, leaving his team scrambling. The month before, his explosive reaction to an overcooked steak had driven his most experienced line cook to quit on the spot. Now, staring at the ruined dish, Miguel caught his reflection in a steel prep table. And for the first time, he truly saw himself through his team's eyes. What we don't often realize is that every emotional reaction creates what I call reaction debt, a cumulative cost that compounds over time, affecting far more than just the moment of explosion. Like financial debt, emotional reaction debt accrues interest, growing larger and more difficult to manage the longer it goes unaddressed. In Miguel's case, each outburst was creating invisible liens against his future success, diminishing staff loyalty, tarnishing his professional reputation, and eroding his own confidence in his leadership abilities. This concept of reaction debt isn't just theoretical. Workplace studies have shown that teams under emotionally volatile leadership experience 37% higher turnover rates and report significantly lower job satisfaction, even when other aspects of their work environment are positive. The stress response triggered by anticipating potential emotional explosions actually impairs cognitive function, leading to more mistakes, creating a vicious cycle of tension and errors. Few people have demonstrated the power of emotional management more effectively than NBA legend Tim Duncan. Throughout his 19-year career with the San Antonio Spurs, Duncan earned the nickname the Big Fundamental, not just for his methodical playing style, but for his extraordinary emotional control under pressure. During Game 6 of the 2013 NBA Finals, after missing a crucial layup that could have secured the championship, Duncan didn't slam the ball in frustration or berate his teammates. Instead, he immediately reset his focus, later explaining, "Every reaction has a cost. Getting emotional wouldn't change the miss, but it would affect the next play." Duncan's approach wasn't about suppressing emotions. It was about understanding their true cost and choosing responses that served his larger goals. In post-career interviews, he revealed that early in his professional journey, he actually mapped out how emotional reactions impacted his game statistics, discovering that even minor displays of frustration led to measurable decreases in both his and his teammates' performance. Back in Le Petit Jardin's kitchen, Miguel took a deep breath. Instead of exploding, he did something unprecedented. He knelt down and began helping clean up the broken plate. "Let's reset," he said quietly, noticing how his staff's tense shoulders relaxed at his measured response. "Maria, please start that dish again. Carlos, help the front of house sort out the timing." The kitchen slowly came back to life, but something had fundamentally shifted. Over the next few weeks, Miguel implemented what he called his pre-shift centering routine, 5 minutes before each service where he reminded himself of the true cost of his reactions. He started acknowledging that every outburst wasn't just a momentary release. It was an investment in failure, with compound interest paid in lost opportunities, damaged relationships, and diminished trust. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. 3 months later, his kitchen had become a different place. The same intensity remained, but it was now directed entirely toward culinary excellence rather than emotional drama. Staff turnover dropped, innovation increased, and for the first time in years, Miguel found himself truly enjoying his role again. Your challenge. For the next 24 hours, become a researcher of your own emotional reactions. Carry a small notebook or use your phone to document each time you react emotionally to a situation. For each instance, record not just what happened, but track the ripple effects. How did others respond? What opportunities or connections might have been affected? How long did the impact last? Pay special attention to the delayed consequences that emerge hours or even days later. At the end of this observation period, review your notes and calculate your own reaction debt. This awareness is your first step toward emotional mastery. Chapter 2. Understanding your emotional blueprint. I can't believe he had the audacity to question my methodology in front of the entire team. Lisa's voice trembled as she paced the break room, her coffee growing cold on the counter. Sarah, her longtime colleague, watched with a mixture of concern and confusion. The email in question had been a mild suggestion about spreadsheet formatting from their project manager. Hardly the professional assault Lisa was describing. Did you read the last line? Please review the attached guidelines when you have a chance. When you have a chance? Lisa's hands gestured emphatically. That's basically saying I don't know how to do my job. Her face flushed as she grabbed her phone, already drafting what would undoubtedly be a defensive response. What makes a seemingly minor comment trigger such an intense emotional cascade? To understand this, we need to journey back to our evolutionary roots. Your brain's threat response system, that ancient alarm bell that kept your ancestors alive, doesn't always distinguish between a saber-toothed tiger and a pointed email. This system, centered in the amygdala, operates like an overprotective security guard who never got the memo that times have changed. Think of your emotional reactions like a sophisticated home security system that was installed during a period of high crime. Even years later, when the neighborhood has become perfectly safe, the alarm still blares at full volume if someone merely touches the doorknob. The system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it was programmed to do. The question isn't whether this response served a purpose, it did, but whether that same response serves you now. In modern contexts, this hair trigger alert system often creates what I call emotional false positives, treating everyday situations as survival threats. When Lisa received that email, her brain wasn't really reacting to the suggestion about spreadsheets. It was responding to a deeper, more primal trigger that had been programmed through years of experience. The formatting comment became tangled with every past moment where her competence had been questioned, real or imagined. Few people understand the power of transforming reactive triggers into purposeful response better than Malala Yousafzai. After surviving an assassination attempt by the Taliban, an experience that could have understandably left her bitter and vengeful, she chose a different path. When I woke up in the hospital, she recalls, I had a choice of being fearful or being fearless. The terrorists wanted me to stop speaking about girls' education. Instead, their attack gave me an even louder voice. What's remarkable about Malala's story isn't just her courage, but her ability to recognize that even the most intense emotional triggers can be redirected. Rather than allowing the attack to program a trigger of fear or rage, she consciously rewired that experience into fuel for her mission. Each potential trigger became an opportunity to demonstrate the very strength her attackers had tried to suppress. This brings us to a crucial tool in emotional mastery: trigger mapping. This technique involves becoming a detective of your own emotional reactions, tracing them back to their original programming. Think of it like debugging software. You can't fix the glitch until you understand where in the code the error originated. For Lisa, this process began with a simple question: when did professional feedback first become threatening? Through careful reflection, she uncovered a pattern stretching back to her years in graduate school, where academic competition was fierce and any criticism could impact her standing. Her brain had learned to treat feedback as a threat to survival in that environment, and had faithfully maintained that programming ever since. As Lisa began to understand this connection, something shifted. Sitting in her office later that week, another email arrived with suggestions about her work. The familiar surge of defensive energy rose, but this time, She recognized it as an echo from the past, rather than a present danger. "It's graduate school talking," she thought, allowing herself to smile at the realization. Instead of firing back in immediate defense, she took a moment to read the email again, this time seeing it for what it actually was: a colleague trying to maintain project consistency. This recognition didn't eliminate her emotional response, but it changed her relationship with it. The trigger became less of a dictator and more of an informant, telling her something useful about her own patterns and needs. Over time, Lisa developed what she called her feedback filter, a mental pause button that allowed her to ask, "Is this threat real, or is it an echo?" Your challenge: the response journal. For the next week, create your own trigger map through careful observation and reflection. Each time you notice an emotional reaction that feels bigger than the situation warrants, document 3 things in your journal. First, describe the current trigger in detail. What exactly was said or done that sparked the reaction? Second, explore how this moment feels familiar. When have you felt this same emotional tone before? Finally, trace the thread back as far as you can remember. When did this type of situation first become meaningful to you? Don't judge what you discover. Simply observe and record. You're not trying to fix anything yet. You're gathering intelligence about your emotional programming. Pay special attention to patterns that emerge across different entries. You might find that seemingly unrelated triggers share a common emotional root system. At the end of the week, review your entries with curiosity rather than criticism. What story does your trigger map tell about the experiences that shaped your emotional responses? This understanding becomes your foundation for transformation, turning unconscious reactions into conscious choices. Chapter 3: The Control Paradox. James Matthews stood before the mahogany double doors of Apex Corporation's main boardroom, straightening his tie for the 7th time in 2 minutes. Inside, 12 board members awaited his presentation on the company's ambitious Asian expansion strategy, a plan he'd spent 6 months crafting. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his watch. "Keep it together," he whispered to himself, clenching his jaw. "Control yourself. Don't let them see you sweat." The moment he began his presentation, James could feel the familiar tightness in his chest. Each slide transition felt like an eternity as he fought to maintain his composure, his voice growing increasingly strained. When CFO Barbara interrupted with pointed questions about market penetration forecasts, James's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His throat constricted, his palms grew damp, and the harder he tried to suppress these reactions, the more pronounced they became. The numbers he'd memorized perfectly just hours ago now seemed to scramble in his mind. This scene plays out countless times across boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms worldwide. We've been conditioned to believe that emotional control means suppression, that the path to composure lies in pushing our feelings down, hiding them away, and maintaining an impassive exterior at all costs. But what if this fundamental assumption about emotional control is actually working against us? Think of emotions like a beach ball you're trying to hold underwater. The harder you push it down, the more force it exerts trying to surface, and the more energy you expend trying to keep it submerged. Eventually, either your strength gives out, or the ball explodes upward with even greater force than if you'd simply let it float naturally. This is what I call the control paradox. The more intensely we try to suppress our emotions, the more power we give them over us. Recent neuroscience research reveals something fascinating. When we attempt to suppress an emotion, we actually activate 2 competing neural networks, one generating the emotion and another trying to inhibit it. This internal tug-of-war consumes massive cognitive resources, leaving us with less mental bandwidth for the very tasks requiring our focus and clarity. Warren Buffett, often called the Oracle of Omaha, provides a masterclass in emotional awareness versus suppression. During the 2008 financial crisis, while other investors panic-sold their holdings as fear gripped the markets, Buffett maintained his legendary equanimity, not by ignoring his emotions, but by acknowledging them fully. "Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful," he famously said. This wasn't just clever wordplay. It was a profound recognition that emotions, when acknowledged rather than suppressed, can become valuable market indicators. In his annual letters to shareholders, Buffett frequently discusses the role of emotional awareness in decision-making. He doesn't pretend to be emotionless. Instead, he treats feelings like fear and excitement as data points to be considered alongside financial metrics. This approach allows him to maintain clarity precisely because he's not wasting energy fighting his emotional responses. The key lies in what I call the emotional acknowledgement protocol, a three-part process that transforms emotions from adversaries into allies. First, we name the emotion specifically, moving beyond vague terms like bad or stressed, to precise descriptors like anxious about being judged or frustrated by lack of control. This linguistic precision helps move activity from the emotional centers of the brain to the prefrontal cortex, where reasoned responses can emerge. Second, we locate the emotion in our body, identifying its physical signatures, the tightness in our chest, the tension in our shoulders, the churning in our stomach. This body-based awareness helps prevent emotions from operating as invisible puppet masters pulling our behavioral strings. Finally, we welcome the emotion's presence without trying to change it, understanding that acceptance paradoxically creates space for transformation. This isn't resignation, it's strategic non-resistance that prevents emotions from gaining power through our opposition to them. Let's return to James in that boardroom. As his anxiety peaked during Barbara's questioning, he remembered the protocol. Instead of trying to suppress his racing heart and constricted throat, he silently acknowledged, "I'm feeling intimidated by these challenges to my work, and it's showing up as tension throughout my body. This is a natural response, and it's okay that it's here." Something unexpected happened in that moment of acceptance. As James stopped expending energy fighting his anxiety, mental resources freed up. He found himself able to listen more carefully to Barbara's concerns, recognizing valid points he hadn't considered. Instead of defending against her questions, he engaged with them curiosity. "That's an important consideration about market penetration," he heard himself say. "Let me show you how we've factored that into our risk assessment." The board's energy shifted. What could have devolved into a defensive presentation became a collaborative discussion. By acknowledging rather than suppressing his emotions, James actually appeared more confident and competent, not less. His willingness to engage openly with challenges while staying grounded in his expertise created the exact impression he'd originally tried to force through suppression. Your challenge: the feel more to react less experiment. Over the next 3 days, I want you to practice emotional acknowledgement in low-stakes situations. Choose one mildly challenging interaction each day, perhaps a disagreement with a colleague or a frustrating customer service call. Instead of trying to control or suppress your emotional response, apply the 3 steps of the protocol. First, name the specific emotion you're experiencing. Second, locate where you feel it in your body. Third, mentally say, "Welcome" to the emotion, allowing it to be present without trying to change it. Keep a brief journal noting what happens to the intensity and duration of the emotion when you practice acceptance versus suppression. Pay particular attention to how this acceptance affects your ability to think clearly and respond effectively in the situation. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate emotional responses, it's to transform your relationship with them from adversary to ally. By learning to work with rather than against your emotions, you'll discover a new kind of emotional mastery that requires less effort and produces better results. Chapter 4: Your Emotional Fingerprint. Here's a startling truth that might shake your confidence. 94% of people believe they have above-average emotional intelligence, a mathematical impossibility that reveals how deeply we misunderstand our emotional selves. This illusion of emotional self-knowledge affects everyone from seasoned executives to mental health professionals, and it's costing us dearly in our relationships, careers, and personal growth. Dr. Rachel stood in her behavioral research lab at Stanford, frowning at the data scrolling across her monitor. 2 participants, both watching the same emotionally charged video, showed completely different physiological responses. Sarah's heart rate had barely flickered, while Michael's had skyrocketed. Even more intriguing, their subsequent behavior differed wildly. Sarah became unusually talkative, while Michael grew quiet and reflective. This makes no sense, Rachel muttered, tapping her pen against the desk. Same stimulus, completely different reactions. She'd been studying emotional responses for 15 years, yet these patterns kept surprising her. The traditional models suggested people should react similarly to the same emotional triggers, but the evidence before her told a different story. What Rachel was discovering, and what I've observed in thousands of cases, is that our emotional responses are as unique as our fingerprints. I call this emotional fingerprinting, and understanding it will revolutionize how you approach emotional mastery. Just as each person's fingerprint follows distinct patterns while sharing basic elements with all other fingerprints, your emotional responses have unique characteristics while following universal human principles. Think about your friend who tears up at every heartwarming commercial while you remain dry-eyed, or how your colleague can shrug off criticism that would keep you awake for nights. These aren't signs that one person is more emotionally mature than the other. They're expressions of different emotional fingerprints. Your emotional fingerprint is shaped by 3 primary factors: genetic predisposition, life experiences, and cultural context. Your genes influence your baseline emotional sensitivity and reactivity. Your experiences, especially early ones, create neural pathways that determine how you process emotional stimuli. And your cultural background provides the framework through which you interpret and express emotions. Bruce Lee, whose insights went far beyond martial arts, understood this principle deeply. In his personal journals, recently made public by his estate, he wrote extensively about emotional self-study. To know oneself is to study oneself in action with another person, he noted, emphasizing that our emotional patterns only become visible through interaction. Lee's training journals reveal how he meticulously documented his emotional responses during sparring matches, noting not just what triggered him, but the specific pattern of his reactions. He discovered that his anger always started with a tightness in his jaw, followed by tunnel vision, a pattern unique to him. This self-knowledge allowed him to develop his famous philosophy of being like water, adapting his responses based on his understanding of his own emotional patterns. Back in Dr. Chen's lab, the breakthrough came when she stopped seeing the varying responses as experimental noise and started treating them as valuable data. What if the difference isn't the problem? What if it's the point? She wondered. This shift in perspective led to a revolutionary discovery. Participants achieved better emotional regulation when they understood and worked with their unique patterns, rather than trying to force themselves into a standardized response model. This brings us to the response pattern mapping technique, a practical tool for identifying your emotional fingerprint. Unlike generic emotional intelligence assessments, this approach helps you map your specific emotional terrain. The key is to track not just what triggers you, but the precise sequence of your emotional response, the physical sensations, the thoughts that arise, and the behaviors that follow. For instance, when Dr. Chen applied this technique to Sarah and Michael's cases, she found that Sarah's apparent calm during the video actually masked an internal process where she verbalized emotions to manage them, hence her subsequent talkativeness. Michael, conversely, processed emotions through internal reflection, leading to his quieter response. Neither pattern was better. They were simply different tools for handling emotional intensity. As Rachel continued her research, she discovered something even more fascinating. Participants who understood and accepted their unique emotional patterns showed greater flexibility in their responses over time. It wasn't about changing their basic pattern. Their emotional fingerprint remained constant. Instead, awareness of their pattern gave them more choices about how to work with it. Let's return to that statistic we opened with. The reason 94% of people overestimate their emotional intelligence isn't because they're delusional. It's because they're judging themselves against a standardized model that doesn't account for emotional fingerprinting. True emotional intelligence starts with understanding your unique pattern. The mirror exercise I'm about to share with you has helped thousands recognize and work with their emotional fingerprint. It's a simple 5-minute daily practice that will revolutionize your understanding of your emotional responses. Each day, you'll document one emotional reaction, noting the trigger, the physical sensations, the thoughts that arose, and your behavioral response. The key is to observe without judgment. You're a scientist studying your own emotional patterns, not a critic evaluating them. Your challenge, the mirror exercise. For the next week, set aside 5 minutes each evening for emotional pattern mapping. Choose one significant emotional reaction from your day. In your journal, record the situation that triggered the emotion. The first physical sensation you noticed. Where did you feel it in your body? The sequence of thoughts that followed. Your behavioral response. Any patterns you notice repeating across different days. Remember, you're not trying to change anything yet. Just observing your unique emotional fingerprint with curiosity and acceptance. Like Bruce Lee studying his responses during sparring, you're gathering intelligence about your emotional patterns that will become the foundation for masterful self-regulation. Chapter 5. The Power of Pace. The rain fell in steady sheets, drumming against the greenhouse windows of Hope Gardens Youth Center. Inside, Marcus knelt beside a raised bed of herbs, his weathered hands guiding a troubled teen named Jay through the gentle act of transplanting basil seedlings. The 17-year-old's shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched. Telltale signs Marcus recognized all too well from his own battles with PTSD after 3 tours in Afghanistan. "You see how we don't just yank the seedling out?" Marcus demonstrated, carefully loosening the soil around the delicate plant. "We create space around it first. Give it room to breathe, room to move." He watched Jay's expression shift from frustration to curiosity. "It's just like those moments when everything inside you wants to explode. You've got to create that same kind of space." The greenhouse door burst open as another teen rushed in, soaking wet and agitated. "Jay! Marcus! Devin's outside talking trash about Jay's little sister again." The basil seedling in Jay's hands trembled as his fingers tightened around the stem. Marcus watched as the boy's chest began to heave, his eyes narrowing. The beginning of a response pattern Marcus knew intimately from both his military days and his own healing journey. This critical moment, the space between trigger and response, is where our greatest power lies. I've spent years studying how people navigate these crucial seconds, and I've discovered that those who master their responses aren't born with supernatural self-control. They've simply learned to create and utilize what I call the response gap. The response gap method centers around 4 key elements that form the acronym PACE. Pause, assess, choose, engage. This isn't just another theoretical framework. It's a practical tool that emerged from real-world experience and has been refined through thousands of high-stakes situations. When you master PACE, you transform from being a prisoner of your reactions to becoming the architect of your responses. See the remarkable journey of Michelle Yeoh, whose masterful performance in Everything Everywhere All at Once required her to switch between multiple emotional states, often within the same scene. During our conversation about emotional control techniques, Yeoh shared how she developed what she calls micropauses, tiny moments of space between emotional transitions that allowed her to reset and recalibrate. "People think acting is about being emotional," Yeoh explained, "but it's actually about having precise control over those emotions. Between takes, between scenes, even between lines, I created these tiny gaps, sometimes just a fraction of a second, where I could center myself and choose my next emotional state rather than being carried away by the previous one." This same principle applies whether you're an Oscar-winning actress managing complex emotional transitions or someone trying to navigate a heated argument with your teenager. The gap between trigger and response is where your power lies. It's where freedom from reactive patterns becomes possible. Back in the greenhouse, Marcus guided Jay through his first practical application of PACE. "Before you move, take one deep breath," he instructed, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's your pause. Just 1 second to interrupt the automatic reaction." Jay's chest rose and fell, his white-knuckled grip on the basil plant gradually loosening. "Now, assess. What's actually happening in your body right now? What thoughts are running through your head?" Marcus kept his voice calm and steady, a technique he'd learned through years of working with both combat veterans and troubled youth. Jay's eyes closed briefly, his expression shifting from rage to something more contemplative. "Choose. You've got options here, more than just fight or flight. What do you want the next moment to look like?" Marcus watched as Jay's shoulders relaxed slightly, his breathing becoming more regulated. Then we engage. We take action, but from a place of choice rather than reaction. The transformation in the greenhouse that day wasn't just about avoiding a fight. It was about Jay discovering his own ability to create space between trigger and response. When he finally did confront Devon, it was with words rather than fists, with purpose rather than pure reaction. The situation that could have ended in violence instead became a moment of profound growth for both teens. Building your response gap starts small, just 1 second. But in that second lies the seed of transformation. Just as a skilled martial artist learns to see openings in their opponent's defense, you can learn to see these tiny spaces between trigger and response in your daily life. Each pause, no matter how brief, is an opportunity to choose differently. Your challenge, the 1-second revolution. For the next 24 hours, I want you to practice inserting a 1-second pause before responding in your casual conversations. This isn't about changing your responses yet. It's simply about creating the gap. Here's how to proceed. In every conversation tomorrow, take 1 deliberate breath before responding to others. Notice how this tiny pause affects both your response and the overall interaction. Pay particular attention to any resistance you feel to taking this pause. That resistance often signals where the practice is most needed. Keep a simple note on your phone or journal tracking 3 elements: when the pause was easy, when it was challenging, and what you noticed about your responses when you successfully created the gap. Remember, we're not aiming for perfection. We're building a new habit 1 second at a time. This simple practice has been the first step in transforming thousands of lives. From combat veterans to corporate executives to teenagers learning to navigate their emotions. Your journey to emotional mastery begins with this single second. Chapter 6. Mapping your trigger landscape. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Elena Torres, CEO of Nexus Innovations, felt her Tesla Model S shudder and die on the interstate. She glanced at her watch. 7:15 a.m. Her make-or-break investor meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp, and she was now stranded 20 miles from downtown San Francisco. As warning lights flashed across her dashboard, Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, that tightening in her chest that typically preceded one of her legendary outbursts. But something was different this morning. Just yesterday, Elena had confided in me during our executive coaching session about how her volatile reactions were beginning to worry her board members. "I built this company from nothing," she'd said. "But lately, it feels like my emotions are running the show instead of me." Her words echo a sentiment I've heard countless times from leaders across industries. The recognition that success isn't just about managing teams or strategies, but about managing our own emotional landscape. What I'm about to share with you transformed Elena's approach to emotional mastery, and it can do the same for you. I call it the trigger landscape, a powerful framework for understanding how your emotional triggers create a unique topography of reactions. Think of it as an emotional terrain map, where each trigger represents different features. Some are like gentle hills we can easily navigate, while others are treacherous cliffs that send us tumbling into reactive patterns. Understanding your trigger landscape isn't about avoiding emotional terrain. It's about becoming a skilled navigator of it. Just as a mountaineer studies the peaks and valleys before an ascent, we can learn to read our emotional territory with precision and skill. This isn't about suppressing reactions. It's about developing an intimate knowledge of your emotional geography. Former President Barack Obama's journey with trigger management offers a masterful example of this approach. During his presidency, he faced an unprecedented level of personal attacks and crisis situations that would have derailed most people. In his memoir, A Promised Land, Obama reveals how he developed what his staff called the long game approach to triggering situations. "I learned to map out not just the immediate triggers," Obama wrote, "but to understand the terrain around them. Every criticism, every crisis, every personal attack, they formed a landscape I needed to navigate strategically, not reactively." His team noticed that as his presidency progressed, Obama became increasingly skilled at anticipating emotional tripwires and preparing for them in advance. He would often say, "Let's walk the terrain first," before engaging in potentially volatile situations. This brings us to the heart of the trigger landscape method, the practice I call terrain walking. Elena, still stranded on the interstate, was about to put this into practice in real time. As she waited for roadside assistance, she pulled out her phone and opened the notes app we'd created together. Instead of fueling her frustration, she began mapping the territory of this situation. She identified the primary triggers: the time pressure, high-stakes meeting, the loss of control, car failure, and the potential judgment from investors. But instead of letting these triggers form an insurmountable mountain, she walked the terrain methodically. "What's the actual landscape here?" she asked herself, using the framework we'd developed. "Are these triggers forming real cliffs, or am I making mountains out of molehills?" The theory behind terrain walking is based on our brain's remarkable capacity for spatial thinking. When we map our triggers as actual territory, we engage different neural pathways than when we're simply reacting to them. This creates new cognitive pathways that give us greater response flexibility. By the time the tow truck arrived at 7:30 a.m., Elena had done something remarkable. She'd transformed what could have been a meltdown into an opportunity. She called her team, arranged for a video conference backup plan, and even prepared an opening joke about Silicon Valley CEOs and their relationship with Tesla vehicles. The investors not only understood the situation, but were impressed by her adaptability and composure under pressure. When Elena later shared this story at our next session, she revealed something crucial. "For the first time, I felt like I was walking through my triggers instead of being ambushed by them. I could see the whole landscape, the immediate reaction, the potential ripple effects, the hidden opportunities. It was like having a map where before I was just wandering blindly." This is the power of understanding your trigger landscape. Each trigger becomes not just a potential pitfall, but a feature of your emotional terrain that you can learn to navigate skillfully. Some triggers might remain challenging peaks, but with practice, you develop the tools to climb them deliberately rather than falling off them repeatedly. Your challenge: the 7-day Trigger Terrain Journal. For the next week, I want you to become a cartographer of your own emotional landscape. Each day, you'll document one significant trigger, but with an important twist. You must find something genuinely amusing or interesting about each triggering situation. This isn't about making light of serious issues. It's about developing the mental flexibility to see your triggers from multiple perspectives. In your journal, either physical or digital, record the following for one trigger each day: the situation that triggered you, your immediate physical and emotional response, something unexpected, amusing, or interesting you noticed about the situation, how the trigger fits into your larger emotional landscape. Remember, the goal isn't to judge or change your triggers this week. It's simply to map them with curiosity and even a touch of humor. Think of yourself as an explorer, documenting the fascinating features of your emotional terrain. By the end of these 7 days, you'll have the beginnings of your personal trigger map, a valuable tool for navigating your emotional landscape with greater skill and awareness. Are you ready to begin exploring your terrain? Chapter 7: The Power of the Strategic Pause. The emergency room doors burst open at Mount Sinai Hospital as paramedics rushed in with 3 critical trauma patients from a multi-vehicle accident. Dr. Aisha Patel, the attending trauma surgeon on duty, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as multiple monitors began blaring simultaneously. With limited resources and 3 lives hanging in the balance, every second counted. Yet instead of immediately jumping into action, Dr. Patel did something that seemed counterintuitive. She took 3 deliberate breaths, her hands resting calmly at her sides. In that brief moment, while her team looked on, something remarkable happened. The chaos of the ER seemed to slow down, allowing her mind to process the scene with crystal clarity. Bay 1, head trauma, needs immediate CT. Bay 2, internal bleeding, prep for emergency surgery. Bay 3, stable but critical, continue monitoring, she directed with precision. Those 3 breaths, lasting no more than 6 seconds, had created just enough space for her to assess, prioritize, and coordinate a response that would save all 3 lives that night. What Dr. Patel demonstrated was far more than just taking a moment to think. She had mastered what I call the strategic pause framework, a powerful approach to decision-making under pressure that challenges our natural instinct to react immediately to urgent situations. This framework isn't about delay. It's about creating a microscopic but crucial gap between stimulus and response, where our best decisions are born. Recent neuroscience research from the Stanford Center for Cognitive and Neurobiological Imaging has shown that even a brief pause of 3 to 6 seconds allows our prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive command center, to engage more fully in our decision-making process. This short delay helps bypass our automatic fight-or-flight response, allowing us to access our higher cognitive functions exactly when we need them most. Notice the mastery of Leonard Bernstein, one of the most celebrated conductors in musical history. Before each performance with the New York Philharmonic, Bernstein would stand motionless on the podium, eyes closed, for several seconds, sometimes up to half a minute. This pause became legendary among musicians and audiences alike. But what many didn't realize was that this wasn't merely for dramatic effect. In his memoirs, Bernstein described these moments as gathering time, where he would align his internal rhythm with the pulse of the music to come. The pause, Bernstein wrote, is not a void. It's a space filled with possibility, where chaos transforms into order. He would teach his orchestra members to embrace these strategic pauses, not just in music, but in their approach to challenges. During particularly difficult passages, he would often stop the orchestra not to correct mistakes, but to allow everyone a moment to reset, a practice that consistently led to breakthrough performances. This brings us to the practical application of the strategic pause framework, what I call the 3 to 3 to 3 technique. This simple but powerful approach involves 3 breaths, 3 body checks, and 3 conscious choices. Each component serves a specific purpose in resetting our nervous system and engaging our optimal decision-making capabilities. Back in the ER, Dr. Patel had begun teaching this technique to her interns, transforming their approach to emergency medicine. The highest pressure moments are precisely when we need to pause, she explained during a teaching session. It seems paradoxical, but that micro-pause is often what prevents us from making costly mistakes. One particularly skeptical intern, Marcus, initially resisted the idea. "We don't have time for this in trauma care," he argued. But after witnessing Dr. Patel's consistent success rate and trying the technique himself, he became its strongest advocate. During a particularly challenging night shift, Marcus used the 3-3-3 technique before treating a complex cardiac case. "Those 9 seconds probably saved my patient's life," he later admitted, "because they helped me notice something in the ECG I might have missed if I'd rushed in." The power of the strategic pause lies not just in the moment of pause itself, but in how it reshapes our relationship with time and pressure. Think of it like a photographer adjusting the shutter speed on a camera. Sometimes slowing down the capture rate results in a clearer, more detailed image. Similarly, these strategic pauses allow us to capture more information and make better decisions, even in high-stakes situations. Dr. Patel's ER team began incorporating structured pauses into their trauma protocols, creating what they called reset points during complex procedures. The results were remarkable: fewer medical errors, better team coordination, and, perhaps surprisingly, faster overall response times. By taking those brief moments to align and assess, they actually became more efficient in their life-saving work. The transformation in Dr. Patel's ER serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most time-critical situations, the right kind of pause can be the most strategic action we can take. What Dr. Patel and her team discovered wasn't just a technique for managing emergency room chaos. They had tapped into a fundamental truth about human performance under pressure. Your challenge: the strategic pause practice. For the next week, I want you to implement what I call the pause practice. Identify 3 key transition moments in your day, perhaps when you first arrive at work, before important meetings, or when you return home. At each of these moments, I want you to take a deliberate 30-second pause. During this pause, implement the 3-3-3 technique. Take 3 conscious breaths, perform 3 body checks, scanning for tension in your shoulders, jaw, and hands, and make 3 conscious choices about how you want to show up in the next moment. In a small notebook or your phone, briefly note how each strategic pause affects your subsequent interactions and decisions. Pay particular attention to any differences you notice in your clarity of thought, emotional state, and the quality of your responses to challenges. Remember, the goal isn't to pause constantly, but to use these strategic moments to reset and realign throughout your day. Are you ready to discover how these small pauses can create big shifts in your life? Chapter 8: Mastering Emotional Bandwidth in a Digital World. Alex stared at his phone screen, the words blurring as his pulse quickened. After careful consideration, we've decided to move in a different direction. The message from BuildRight, his startup's largest client, representing 40% of their revenue, sat like a digital bomb in his inbox. His carefully crafted exterior remained unchanged, back straight, face neutral, breathing steady, as he sat in his open-plan office. But beneath this composed surface, a storm was brewing. 3 years of building relationships, countless late nights ensuring deliverables exceeded expectations, and now this, all delivered through a sterile email at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. His mind raced through implications: payroll, team morale, investor confidence. The familiar tightness crept into his chest as notifications continued pinging around him. Slack messages, calendar reminders, emails demanding responses. Each digital intrusion felt like another weight pressing down on his already strained emotional capacity. In today's hyper-connected world, we face a challenge our ancestors never imagined: managing our emotional responses in an environment of constant digital stimulation. Every ping, notification, and update demands a piece of our emotional energy, what I call our emotional bandwidth. Like internet bandwidth, which has a finite capacity for data transmission, our ability to process and respond to emotional stimuli has limits. When we exceed these limits, we experience what I term emotional buffering, that overwhelming sensation of emotional overload that leads to either shutdown or overflow. The modern workplace has become an emotional bandwidth battleground. We're expected to maintain professional composure while managing an endless stream of digital interactions, each carrying its own emotional weight. A single hour might bring a congratulatory email about a successful project, a passive-aggressive Slack message from a colleague, and a concerning text from a family member, all while we're trying to focus on critical tasks. This challenge becomes even more complex for leaders like Alex, who must manage not only their own emotional bandwidth, but also serve as emotional bandwidth routers for their teams. The ability to process, prioritize, and respond appropriately to this constant flow of emotional data has become a crucial leadership skill, one that requires a completely new approach to emotional intelligence. Notice how Serena Williams revolutionized her approach to emotional management after becoming a mother. In a revealing interview, she described how motherhood forced her to develop what she calls dual awareness, the ability to maintain intense competitive focus while simultaneously monitoring her emotional state with the perspective of a parent. "Before, I was all fire," she explained. "Now, I understand how to use that fire without letting it consume me." Williams began implementing a unique system during matches, using the brief moments between points to perform what she called emotional bandwidth checks. She would quickly assess 3 things: her current emotional state, her available emotional energy, and the most effective way to direct that energy. This practice allowed her to maintain peak performance while preventing emotional overload, even in the most pressure-filled situations. The key was learning that emotional awareness isn't about suppressing intensity, Williams shared. It's about understanding your emotional bandwidth capacity and making conscious choices about how to allocate it. She described how this approach transformed her response to crucial moments in matches, allowing her to stay composed during challenges that would have previously triggered an emotional cascade. The most remarkable aspect of Williams's transformation was how she adapted these principles to handle the increased emotional demands of balancing professional athletics with motherhood. She developed what she called her bandwidth expansion routine, a systematic approach to gradually increasing her capacity for emotional processing through deliberate practice and self-awareness. This brings us back to Alex, who found himself at a similar crossroads. As he sat with the client departure email, something shifted in his awareness. Instead of immediately reacting or suppressing his response, he began to notice the layered nature of his emotional experience. The initial shock, the underlying fear, the subtle threat of relief. This client had been increasingly difficult to satisfy, and a surprising spark of excitement about potential new directions. By acknowledging these emotions without immediately acting on them, Alex discovered he had more bandwidth available than he realized. He closed his email, turned off notifications, and took 10 minutes to map out his emotional landscape using the Emotional Bandwidth Calculator, a tool designed to help assess current emotional capacity and allocation. This pause proved transformative. When Alex finally gathered his team to share the news, he approached it not as a crisis to manage, but as an opportunity to demonstrate emotional leadership. He began by acknowledging the weight of the situation. I want to be transparent about what I'm feeling right now, because I imagine many of you will have similar reactions when I share this news. This emotional authenticity created a space for his team to process their own responses productively. Instead of panic, the meeting evolved into a strategic discussion about diversifying their client base, something they'd been hesitant to prioritize while comfortable with BuildRight's business. The very challenge that could have overwhelmed their collective emotional bandwidth became a catalyst for growth. The next few weeks saw Alex implementing systematic changes in how his team managed their emotional bandwidth. They introduced digital pressure valves, designated times when notifications were turned off company-wide, allowing everyone to process and respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. They started team meetings with brief emotional bandwidth check-ins, normalizing the practice of monitoring and managing emotional energy as a crucial business skill. Most significantly, they began treating emotional bandwidth as a measurable resource, just like time or money. Team members learned to recognize signs of bandwidth depletion and developed strategies for bandwidth recovery. The result was not just better emotional management, but improved decision-making and client relationships across the board. 3 months after losing BuildRight, Alex's company had secured 2 new clients, each more aligned with their long-term vision. The team was more cohesive, communication had improved, and, perhaps most importantly, they had developed a sustainable approach to managing emotional energy in their high-pressure digital-first environment. This transformation illustrates a crucial truth. In our digital age, emotional intelligence must evolve beyond simple awareness and regulation. We need a sophisticated understanding of our emotional bandwidth, how to measure it, expand it, and allocate it effectively across the countless demands of modern life. Your challenge, the digital emotion log. For the next 24 hours, I want you to become a scientist of your own emotional bandwidth. Create what I call a digital emotion log, tracking your emotional responses to digital interactions throughout your day. Each time you engage with a digital trigger, email, message, social media post, or notification, take a moment to note. Remember, the goal isn't to judge or change your responses immediately, but to develop a clear picture of your current emotional bandwidth patterns. This awareness is the first step toward mastering your emotional responses in our increasingly digital world. Are you ready to discover your true emotional bandwidth capacity? Chapter 9. The 3-Second Revolution. Maya Rossi's kindergarten classroom had hosted hundreds of parent-teacher conferences, but this one was rapidly approaching nuclear territory. Across her tiny rainbow-colored table sat Mr. Davidson, his face flushed red as he jabbed his finger at his son Tyler's progress report. Next to him, Mrs. Davidson's arms were crossed so tightly it seemed she might snap in half, while Principal looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This is completely unacceptable." Mr. Davidson's voice rose with each word. "Tyler is gifted. We had him tested. And you're telling me he's struggling with basic cooperation? There must be something wrong with your teaching methods." The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder as tension filled the room. Maya felt her own emotions rising, the familiar defensive surge that came with having her professional judgment questioned. But instead of engaging with that surge, Maya did something unexpected. She softly placed her hands flat on the table, took a single deep breath, and shifted her gaze to the family photo on her desk. 1, 2, 3. In those 3 seconds, everything changed. When she looked back at the Davidsons, her energy had completely transformed. Before we continue, I'd love to show you something amazing Tyler created yesterday, Maya said warmly, reaching for a colorful art project. It shows exactly the kind of brilliant thinking you're describing. The shift in her energy was so palpable that Mr. Davidson's finger slowly lowered and Mrs. Davidson's arms began to loosen. Within minutes, the conversation had transformed from confrontational to collaborative. This seemingly magical transformation hinges on what I call the 3-second reset, a precise protocol for interrupting emotional escalation at its earliest stages. While 3 seconds might seem impossibly short, neuroscience shows this brief window is actually optimal for emotional pattern interruption. It's long enough to break an emotional spiral, but short enough to implement in real-world situations without creating awkward pauses or losing conversational flow. The beauty of this technique lies in its simplicity. Unlike complex emotional management strategies that require extensive practice or perfect conditions, the 3-second reset can be implemented anywhere, anytime. It works because it targets what neuroscientists call the emotional inception point, that crucial moment when our brain begins to construct an emotional response but hasn't yet fully committed to it. Think of it like catching a ball before it builds momentum rolling downhill. Once that ball gains speed, it becomes increasingly difficult to stop. But with just the right intervention at the start, you can easily change its direction. Your emotional responses work in exactly the same way. The key is recognizing and intervening at that crucial inception point. Look at how Keanu Reeves developed his famously unshakable calm. While many attribute his composed demeanor to natural temperament, interviews with his colleagues reveal a deliberately cultivated practice. During the filming of The Matrix, Reeves worked with his martial arts instructors to develop what he called his reset ritual, a 3-second practice he could use between intense action sequences to shift his emotional state. People think it's about suppressing emotions, Reeves explained in a rare interview about his technique, but it's actually about creating space to choose your response. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much, but it's all you need to shift from reaction to intention. He described how he would use this reset countless times during filming, especially in scenes requiring rapid emotional transitions. The technique proved so effective that Reeves began applying it off-set, particularly in challenging public situations. Whether faced with intrusive paparazzi or overwhelming fan encounters, his reset ritual allowed him to maintain his characteristic grace under pressure. It's like having a secret superpower, he shared. No matter what's happening around you, you always have those 3 seconds to reset. What makes Reeves's approach particularly interesting is how he personalized the basic reset framework. He incorporated subtle physical anchors, a specific way of shifting his weight or changing his breath, that worked for his unique needs. This personalization is crucial for making the technique your own. The 3-second reset consists of 3 distinct components: physical interruption, mental redirect, and response choice. The physical interruption can be as subtle as changing your breathing pattern or as overt as shifting your body position. The mental redirect involves quickly moving your attention to a pre-selected neutral or positive focal point. The response choice is your opportunity to consciously select how you want to proceed. Let's return to Maya's classroom to see how these components played out in practice. Her physical interruption was placing her hands on the table, a gesture that both grounded her and subtly reset the room's dynamic. Her mental redirect was looking at the family photo on her desk, a reminder of why she chose teaching and what truly matters in her work. Her response choice was to shift the conversation toward Tyler's strengths rather than engaging with the confrontational energy. After experiencing the power of this technique firsthand, Maya began incorporating it into her classroom management strategy. She created a reset corner where students could take their 3-second resets when feeling overwhelmed. She taught them simplified versions of the technique, using age-appropriate analogies like catching your feelings before they become too big. The results were remarkable. Within weeks, playground conflicts decreased significantly. students began spontaneously using their reset moments during challenging situations. Even parents reported their children teaching them the technique at home. Stop, breathe, choose became a classroom mantra, with students proudly tracking their reset victories on a special chart. Perhaps the most touching transformation occurred with Tyler Davidson himself. Once Maya helped him understand his emotional patterns using the reset technique, his cooperation issues began to resolve naturally. He discovered he could use his 3-second resets to handle frustration during challenging tasks, leading to improved focus and participation. At the next parent-teacher conference, Mr. and Mrs. Davidson were amazed by the change in their son. "I can't believe this is the same classroom," Mrs. Davidson admitted. "We've even started using Tyler's reset technique at home." Mr. Davidson, notably calmer than in their previous meeting, added, "I wish I'd learned this when I was his age." This ripple effect, from teacher to students to families, illustrates a crucial truth about emotional management techniques. When they're simple enough to implement but powerful enough to create real change, they naturally spread through communities. The 3-second reset works because it meets both these criteria, providing immediate results while being easily teachable to others. Your challenge: Reset Roulette. Over the next week, you're going to engage in what I call Reset Roulette, a structured game that helps you master the 3-second reset in progressively challenging situations. Think of it as building your emotional muscles through graduated exposure. Start with Level 1 triggers, minor annoyances like a slow-loading website or a long line at the coffee shop. Practice your reset technique in these low-stakes situations. Notice how your body feels before, during, and after each reset. What physical interrupt works best for you? What mental redirect helps you shift most effectively? As you build confidence, move to Level 2 triggers, moderate challenges like a critical email or a minor disagreement. Pay attention to how the technique needs to adjust as the emotional stakes increase. Does your original physical interrupt still work, or do you need something more substantial? By the end of the week, challenge yourself with Level 3 triggers, situations that typically provoke strong emotional responses. These might be challenging conversations, professional pressures, or personal frustrations. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate emotional responses, but to create that crucial 3-second space for conscious choice. Keep a simple record of your reset attempts, noting what worked, what didn't, and any patterns you observe. Pay special attention to your personal, emotional inception points, those crucial moments when you first feel an emotional response beginning to build. Are you ready to discover how 3 seconds can transform your emotional landscape? Chapter 10. The Power of Redirection. The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, and I can already feel the rage building. My hands are shaking, my jaw is clenched, and all I can think about is how they're trying to torpedo my project. Nina stood in the women's restroom of Horizon Technologies, staring at her reflection as these thoughts raced through her mind. 6 months of work on a revolutionary sustainable packaging design was about to be challenged by the old guard who seemed determined to maintain the status quo. The familiar taste of metal filled her mouth as her anger intensified. Her team had worked countless late nights perfecting this design. They'd solved problems everyone said were impossible, and now Marcus from operations was rallying to shut it down before it even got a fair hearing. Through the mirror, Nina watched her face flush red as she recalled his dismissive email from last night. While innovative, this design presents unnecessary operational risks. The bathroom door swung open, startling Nina from her thoughts. Sarah, her mentor from HR, walked in and immediately recognized the signs of pre-meeting distress. 10 deep breaths, Sarah said softly, moving to stand beside her. Then tell me what's really going on. The energy coursing through Nina's body demanded release. Her natural instinct was to suppress it, to force herself to appear calm and collected. But Sarah had taught her differently. Channel it, she heard Sarah's voice remind her. Energy doesn't disappear. It transforms. This fundamental principle, that emotional energy, like physical energy, cannot be destroyed but can be transformed, lies at the heart of what I call the energy redirection protocol. Think of your emotions as water flowing through a river system. You can't simply make the water disappear, but you can direct its flow through different channels, turning potentially destructive force into productive power. When we experience intense emotions like anger, fear, or frustration, we're actually experiencing a surge of energy in our system. Traditional advice often tells us to calm down or let it go, but this approach fundamentally misunderstands how emotional energy works. You can't eliminate this energy. You can only transform it. Consider what happens when you try to suppress strong emotions. Like damming a powerful river, the pressure builds until it either breaks through destructively or requires enormous energy to maintain the barrier. This is why people who appear to have perfect emotional control often experience unexpected breakdowns or develop physical symptoms of stress. The energy redirection protocol offers a different approach. Instead of fighting against emotional energy, it teaches you to recognize it as a powerful force that can be channeled into productive outcomes. This isn't about suppression or denial. It's about intelligent energy management. Eleanor Roosevelt's life provides a masterclass in this principle. Born into privilege but faced with numerous personal challenges, including debilitating social anxiety and fear of public speaking, Roosevelt could have retreated into a conventional role of quiet support. Instead, she developed what she called her conversion practice, actively transforming her fear and anxiety into fuel for pioneering activism. During her time as First Lady, Roosevelt faced intense criticism and opposition for her progressive views and active public role. Rather than allowing fear of criticism to silence her, she channeled that emotional energy into more determined advocacy for civil rights and social justice. You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face, she wrote, describing her process of transforming emotional energy into purposeful action. One particularly telling example occurred during the height of the Great Depression. Roosevelt felt overwhelming anxiety about the suffering she witnessed across the country. Instead of becoming paralyzed by these feelings, she channeled that emotional energy into creating hands-on programs for economic recovery. Her famous tours of impoverished areas, where she insisted on seeing conditions firsthand, were direct applications of her energy redirection principle. The very fear that would have once kept me isolated in my comfortable world, she later wrote, became the force that drove me to witness and work for change. This transformation of fear into productive action exemplifies the core principle of energy. Redirection, emotional energy, properly channeled, becomes fuel for meaningful achievement. The channel shift technique builds on Roosevelt's intuitive understanding, providing a structured approach to emotional energy redirection. The technique involves three key elements: recognition, redirection, and reinforcement. Recognition means acknowledging the emotional energy present in your system without judgment. Redirection involves consciously choosing where to channel that energy. Reinforcement creates lasting pathways for positive energy flow through consistent practice. Back in the Horizon Technologies bathroom, Nina began applying these principles with Sarah's guidance. Instead of trying to suppress her anger about the opposition to her project, she acknowledged the intense energy coursing through her system. Rather than viewing it as an obstacle to overcome, she recognized it as potential fuel for her presentation. What if, Sarah suggested, you could channel this exact same energy into passionate advocacy for your design? The physical symptoms are similar: elevated heart rate, heightened awareness, intense focus. The only difference is how you direct that energy. Nina closed her eyes and began the redirection process. She felt the angry energy in her body, the tension in her shoulders, the heat in her chest, the alertness in her mind. Instead of fighting these sensations, she imagined redirecting them, like adjusting the flow of a powerful river. The same force that had been generating defensive thoughts now fueled her preparation for an engaging presentation. Opening her laptop, Nina began restructuring her presentation with this redirected energy. Instead of defensively anticipating objections, she channeled her intensity into crafting a compelling narrative about innovation and possibility. The very details that Marcus had criticized became powerful examples of creative problem-solving. "I can feel the difference," Nina said, reviewing her revised opening slides. "It's like the energy that was making me want to fight is now making me want to inspire." Sarah nodded, recognizing the successful application of the channel shift technique. The board meeting that followed became a turning point in Nina's career. Walking into the conference room, she carried the same amount of energy as before, but it manifested completely differently. Instead of defensive tension, she projected passionate expertise. Rather than reacting to challenges with anger, she engaged with them as opportunities to demonstrate the depth of her team's solutions. Marcus's skeptical questions, which might have previously triggered angry responses, became chances to showcase the design's innovative features. The energy that had earlier manifested as rage now powered a compelling presentation that kept even the most doubtful board members engaged. "I've never seen sustainability metrics presented so convincingly," one board member commented afterward. Another noted, "Your passion for this project is contagious, but what really impressed me was how thoroughly you addressed potential concerns." Nina's successful redirection of her emotional energy not only saved her project, but also established a new pattern for handling future challenges. In the weeks that followed, she found herself automatically looking for ways to channel difficult emotions into productive action. When frustration arose with project delays, she redirected that energy into creative problem-solving. When anxiety emerged about timeline pressures, she channeled it into detailed planning and team coordination. Your challenge: the energy mapping exercise. Over the next week, you'll create your personal energy redirection map. Each evening, spend 5 minutes documenting one strong emotion you experienced during the day. But here's the crucial part. You're not just recording the emotion, you're tracking its transformation. Start by identifying the emotion's physical signatures. Where did you feel it in your body? What sensations accompanied it? Then document how you redirected, or could have redirected, that energy. Be specific about both the redirection process and its outcomes. If anger became determination, how exactly did that shift occur? If anxiety transformed into thorough preparation, what steps facilitated that change? By the end of the week, you'll have a personal playbook of 7 different energy redirections. Look for patterns in what works best for you. Which types of emotional energy are easiest for you to redirect? Which challenging emotions might benefit from similar redirection strategies? Remember, you're not trying to eliminate emotional energy. You're learning to harness it as a force for positive change. What powerful river of emotion will you redirect first? Chapter 11. The Art of Active Calm. The announcements echoed through Terminal C like thunder. All flights to the eastern seaboard are delayed indefinitely due to severe weather conditions. David Park, customer service manager at Pacific International Airport, watched the immediate ripple effect sweep through the crowded terminal. Hundreds of faces transformed from tired patience to mounting anger. A businessman slammed his laptop shut. A mother with 3 exhausted children fought back tears. The line at his service counter stretched longer by the second. In his 15 years of airport management, David had seen his share of crisis situations. But something felt different today. Instead of the familiar surge of anxiety that usually accompanied these moments, he felt an unusual sense of clarity. Just that morning, he'd been practicing the new response techniques he'd learned in last week's leadership workshop. Now, facing what could easily become a full-blown crisis, he had a choice to make. Taking a deliberate breath, David noticed his feet planted firmly on the ground. He felt the subtle vibration of the terminal's activity through his shoes, anchoring him to the present moment. While chaos erupted around him, he maintained what athletes call relaxed readiness, fully alert, yet completely centered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a calm authority that made several nearby passengers turn to listen. "I know you're frustrated, and you have every right to be. I'm going to share everything I know about the situation, and then my team and I will work with each of you individually to find the best possible solutions." The energy in the terminal shifted subtly. Something in David's presence, his combination of complete engagement and unshakable composure, caught people's attention. Even those who remained angry seemed to direct their energy more constructively, moving from unfocused frustration to specific questions and concerns. This state of engaged composure, what I call active calm, represents a fundamental shift in how we approach high-pressure situations. Unlike passive calmness, which often resembles withdrawal or detachment, active calm is a dynamic state that combines heightened awareness with strategic response. It's the difference between a pond's surface being still because it's frozen and being still because it's perfectly balanced. Research from sports psychology and military training reveals that this state of active calm creates optimal conditions for both decision-making and leadership. Studies of elite athletes show that their peak performances occur not in a state of complete relaxation, but in this zone of engaged composure, what sports psychologists call relaxed readiness. Similarly, military research has found that special forces operators maintain this same state during complex missions, allowing them to remain both vigilant and clear-headed under extreme pressure. Tom Hanks provides a masterful example of active calm in action, particularly during the filming of Cast Away. The production presented unprecedented challenges. Hanks had to carry entire portions of the film alone, undergo dramatic physical transformation, and maintain emotional authenticity through grueling shooting conditions. The filming schedule was split into 2 parts, with a year-long break in between for Hanks to lose weight and transform his appearance for the island sequences. During one particularly challenging scene, where his character had to fail repeatedly at making fire, Hanks spent hours performing physically demanding movements while maintaining the precise emotional arc the scene required. The temperature soared over 100 degrees, and the crew was exhausted. Instead of letting frustration take over, Hanks demonstrated active calm mastery. Between takes, rather than retreating to his trailer, he remained fully engaged with the crew while maintaining his inner composure. He used movement to stay energized, but not agitated, kept his speech measured but warm, and maintained constant awareness of how his energy affected the entire production team. Director Robert Zemeckis later noted that Hanks's ability to stay both fully present and completely centered helped the entire crew navigate the challenging shoot. The key, Hanks shared in a later interview, was learning to be simultaneously fully invested and completely detached. You have to care enormously about the work while letting go of any anxiety about the outcome. This paradoxical state, intense engagement without emotional reactivity, perfectly captures the essence of active calm. Back in the terminal, David began implementing the 4 pillars of active calm. First, through grounded awareness, he maintained constant contact with his physical presence. Feet planted, breathing steady, posture balanced. This created a stable foundation from which to engage with the crisis. Second, he employed responsive listening, not just hearing passengers' complaints, but actively engaging with their concerns while maintaining his center. When an angry businessman demanded immediate answers, David maintained eye contact while letting the man's fury wash over him like water over rocks, acknowledging it without being displaced by it. The third pillar, strategic movement, proved crucial as David navigated the crowded terminal. Instead of rushing frantically between passengers, he moved with purpose and presence. Each step was intentional, his gestures were clear and calming, and his physical presence helped regulate the terminal's emotional temperature. Finally, through intentional speech, David chose his words carefully and delivered them with measured authority. Rather than matching the passenger's elevated emotional tone or retreating into bureaucratic jargon, he spoke with direct human clarity. "I understand this disruption is affecting important events in your lives. Let's look at your situation specifically and find the best available options." As the crisis unfolded, something remarkable happened. David's active calm began to influence the entire terminal's atmosphere. His team members, initially tense and defensive, began mirroring his composed engagement. Passengers, while still frustrated, started shifting from reactive anger to productive problem-solving. A young mother with 3 overtired children caught David's attention. Instead of just offering standard solutions, he maintained his centered awareness while actively engaging with her specific situation. "I notice your youngest is getting overwhelmed by all this," he said, his voice steady and warm. "Let's find you a quieter space first, then work out your travel options." This combination of full presence and complete composure allowed David to see beyond immediate reactions to underlying needs. He organized an impromptu children's area with coloring books and snacks from airport vendors. He arranged for priority rebooking for elderly passengers and those with urgent medical needs. Each solution emerged from this state of engaged clarity rather than reactive problem-solving. "I've never seen anything like it," one of David's team members remarked later. "The situation was just as bad as other major delays, but the way we handled it and the way passengers responded was completely different." By maintaining active calm, David had transformed a potential crisis into an opportunity to demonstrate exceptional service. 3 hours into the delay, the terminal had transformed. While passengers were still dealing with significant disruptions, the atmosphere had shifted from chaos to focused cooperation. Small groups formed around charging stations, sharing travel stories and local hotel recommendations. David's team moved through the crowd with renewed confidence, each embodying their own version of active calm. When the weather finally cleared and flights resumed, several passengers made a point of thanking David personally. "I've been through dozens of delays," one frequent flyer told him, "but I've never felt so well cared for during one." Another noted, "Your calmness was contagious. It helped me handle this so much better than I usually do." The active calm approach had turned a potentially volatile situation into a powerful example of emotional leadership. By maintaining high awareness while keeping reactivity low, David created a space where effective solutions could emerge naturally. His story demonstrates that true composure isn't about being less engaged, it's about being more skillfully engaged. Your challenge, the calm and chaos exercise. For the next week, choose one typically stressful daily activity: your morning commute, grocery shopping during peak hours, or a busy coffee shop run. During this activity, you'll practice maintaining active calm while staying fully engaged with your environment. Start by establishing your grounded awareness. Feel your feet, notice your breathing, maintain physical centeredness. As you move through the activity, consciously engage each pillar of active calm. Practice responsive listening with everyone you encounter. Use strategic movement as you navigate the space, and employ intentional speech in every interaction. Pay particular attention to the balance between engagement and composure. Notice when you tend to tip toward either over-engagement, getting caught up in the stress, or under-engagement, withdrawing from the situation. Keep a brief note after each practice session. What helped you maintain active calm? What challenged it? How did others respond to your centered presence? Remember, the goal isn't to be unnaturally serene. Instead, you're developing the dynamic capability to stay fully present while maintaining your center, just as a skilled surfer stays upright by actively engaging with the waves. How will you ride today's challenges with active calm? Chapter 12. Breaking Reactive Patterns. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Sofia Martinez's award-winning garden, where she knelt in contemplative focus. Her hands moved with practiced precision, identifying and extracting invasive weeds that threatened to overtake her carefully cultivated space. But today's gardening session carried deeper meaning. Each weed she pulled represented an old reactive pattern she was working to uproot from her life. "Just like these morning glories," she muttered, carefully tracing a vine to its root system. "Beautiful on the surface, but if you don't get to the root, they'll strangle everything else." Her mind wandered to yesterday's phone call with her daughter, where she'd caught herself before falling into their usual pattern of tension and defensive reactions. Instead of responding with her habitual sharp tone when challenged, she'd paused, remembered her new practice, and chosen a different path. Sophia's hands stilled as she noticed a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation that arose during difficult conversations. In the garden, this physical signal often meant she was pulling too aggressively, potentially damaging good plants along with the weeds. In her relationships, it signaled she was about to react from an old script rather than respond from present awareness. This connection between physical patterns in her garden and emotional patterns in her life had become Sophia's personal laboratory for transformation. Each morning, as she tended her beloved plants, she practiced identifying and gently interrupting patterns that no longer served her growth. Just as a garden's health depends on understanding the invisible systems operating beneath the soil, our emotional well-being relies on recognizing the hidden patterns that drive our reactions. These patterns, what I call the pattern recognition matrix, form through years of experiences, creating automatic responses that often operate outside our conscious awareness. Think of these patterns as emotional shortcuts your brain has created to handle situations efficiently. Like a well-worn path through a forest, these reactive patterns become our default route simply because we've traveled them so many times before. The challenge isn't that these patterns exist, they're a natural part of how our brains operate, but rather that we often follow them unconsciously, even when they lead us away from our desired destination. Denzel Washington's journey provides a powerful example of pattern recognition and transformation in action. Early in his career, Washington noticed a pattern in how he handled professional criticism. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, he developed a defensive pattern of meeting any challenge with immediate pushback, a strategy that had served him well on the streets but was hindering his growth as an actor. "I had to learn that not every criticism was an attack," Washington shared in a masterclass interview. "I realized I was bringing old patterns from my past into situations where they didn't belong." His breakthrough came when he developed what he called his three-beat pause, a simple but powerful practice of waiting 3 beats before responding to any critique. This pattern interruption allowed Washington to assess whether his reactive impulse came from the present situation or an old script. "It changed everything," he reflected. "Instead of automatically defending, I could actually hear what directors and fellow actors were trying to tell me. That's when my work really started to deepen." The transformation wasn't immediate. Like Sophia in her garden, Washington had to consistently identify and gently redirect his ingrained patterns. He developed a systematic approach, what he called his scene check, where he would regularly pause to assess whether he was acting from present awareness or reactive patterns. This methodical approach to pattern transformation aligns perfectly with what neuroscience tells us about habit change. Research shows that trying to eliminate patterns through sheer willpower often backfires, strengthening the very patterns we're trying to change. Instead, sustainable transformation comes through awareness, gentle interruption, and consistent redirection, exactly the approach Washington developed. Back in the garden, Sophia straightened up, surveying her morning's work. The pulled weeds formed a substantial pile beside her, but she knew from experience that simply pulling wasn't enough. "You have to replace them with something stronger," she often told her gardening students. "Nature abhors a vacuum. If you don't plant something intentional in that space, the weeds will just come right back." This wisdom applies perfectly to the pattern interruption protocol, a systematic approach to transforming reactive patterns into responsive choices. The protocol involves 3 key elements: pattern recognition, gentle interruption, and intentional replacement. Pattern recognition requires developing awareness of your reactive patterns without judgment. Just as Sophia learned to identify different types of weeds by their leaf patterns and root systems, you can learn to recognize your reactive patterns through their emotional and physical signatures. Gentle interruption involves creating a pause between trigger and reaction, a moment of choice where you can decide whether to follow the old pattern or choose a new response. This isn't about forcing or fighting against the pattern, but rather about creating space for alternative possibilities. Intentional replacement focuses on gradually establishing new response patterns that better serve your growth. Like planting beneficial species in a garden, this step involves consciously cultivating responses aligned with who you want to become. As Sophia implemented these principles in her life, she began noticing profound changes in her relationships. The pattern of tension with her daughter, built over years of mutual reactivity, began to shift. Instead of their usual defensive dance, Sophia learned to recognize the early signs of the pattern, create space for new possibilities, and choose responses that nurtured connection rather than conflict. "Mom, you're different lately," her daughter remarked during their weekly Sunday dinner. "You're still you, but somehow calmer, more present." Sophia smiled, thinking of all the mornings she'd spent in her garden, practicing pattern recognition while pulling weeds. "I'm learning to tend to relationships the way I tend to my gardens," she replied, "with patience, attention, and trust in the process of growth. The transformation went beyond her immediate family. Sophia began noticing how her new awareness affected her community gardening classes. Where she once might have reacted with frustration to students' mistakes, she now saw these moments as opportunities to demonstrate gentle course correction. Her classes became spaces not just for learning about plants, but for practicing emotional intelligence through gardening metaphors. One student, struggling with persistent anxiety, found particular resonance in Sophia's approach. "When you showed me how to identify invasive species by their growth patterns," she shared, "I realized I could do the same thing with my worry patterns. Now, when anxiety starts spreading like bindweed through my thoughts, I can recognize it early and redirect my attention to more nurturing activities." This ripple effect illustrated a crucial truth about pattern transformation. When we change our reactive patterns, we don't just change our own experience, we create space for others to change as well. Like a healthy garden that naturally supports beneficial insects and birds, transformed patterns create an ecosystem that nurtures growth in all our relationships. As the morning light strengthened, Sophia began gathering her tools, preparing to shift from her garden practice to her daily life. She knew that the real test of her pattern transformation work wouldn't happen here in the peaceful garden, but in the complex interactions of her day. Yet she felt ready, equipped with her pattern recognition matrix understanding and her pattern interruption protocol practice. Looking at her garden one last time before heading inside, Sophia noticed a single morning glory bloom that had escaped her weeding. Instead of immediately pulling it, she paused to admire its beauty while also acknowledging its potential to overwhelm. This balance, appreciating what is while choosing what to cultivate, perfectly captured the essence of pattern transformation. Your challenge: the pattern diary exercise. For the next 7 days, you'll maintain a pattern diary, but with an empowering twist that transforms simple observation into active growth. Each evening, take 5 minutes to document one reactive pattern you noticed that day. But instead of just describing what happened, you'll create a 3-part entry. First, describe the pattern you noticed, what triggered it, how it felt in your body, and how you typically respond. Be specific but compassionate in your observation, as if you're studying an interesting natural phenomenon rather than judging a personal flaw. Second, imagine one small way you could respond differently tomorrow if a similar situation arises. This isn't about crafting a perfect response, but rather about exploring possibilities. Like a gardener considering where to plant new seeds, you're simply mapping potential alternatives. Finally, and this is the empowering twist, write down one strength or quality you already possess that could help you implement this new response. Perhaps you have a good sense of humor that could help diffuse tension, or maybe your natural curiosity could help you ask questions instead of reacting defensively. Remember, like tending a garden, pattern transformation is a gradual process that requires patience, consistency, and trust in the natural cycles of growth. How will you begin cultivating your emotional garden today? Chapter 13: Strategic Emotional Expression. The investors fell silent as Vanessa slammed her hand on the table, but unlike her previous outbursts, this one was carefully calculated. She watched their reactions shift from initial shock to dawning understanding as she let her genuine frustration show through in measured doses. "For 3 years," she said, her voice carrying the weight of controlled passion, "we've revolutionized how small businesses handle their supply chains. And now you're suggesting we abandon them for larger clients?" Vanessa Rodriguez hadn't always wielded her emotions with such precision. 6 months earlier, she would have either exploded in uncontrolled anger or forced herself to maintain an artificial calm, both approaches that had cost her dearly in the past. But today was different. Today, she was choosing exactly how much emotion to reveal and when. The art of strategic expression isn't about manipulating others or being inauthentic. Instead, it's about understanding that emotional expression exists on a spectrum and choosing where on that spectrum to operate in any given situation. Think of it like a master violinist controlling the pressure on their bow. Too light, and the music lacks depth. Too heavy, and it becomes harsh. The sweet spot lies in conscious choice. Most of us have been taught two extreme approaches to handling emotions in professional settings. Either suppress them entirely, or just be authentic and let them flow unchecked. But this black and white thinking ignores the rich middle ground where true emotional mastery lives. Strategic expression offers a third path, one where we consciously choose how much emotion to display based on our goals and context. Lady Gaga provides a masterful example of strategic expression in action. While she's known for dramatic emotional displays on stage, a closer look reveals the careful calibration behind each performance. During her Oscar-winning role in A Star is Born, she spoke about how she would consciously dial her emotional expression up or down, depending on what each scene required. "There's a difference," she explained in a Variety interview, "between feeling everything fully and choosing how much of that feeling to share with the world. It's not about being fake, it's about being intentional." This approach became particularly evident in her advocacy work for mental health and LGBTQ+ rights, where she learned to balance vulnerable personal disclosures with professional boundaries. One particularly powerful example came during her testimony for the Born This Way Foundation, where she shared her personal trauma story. Observers noted how she maintained precise control over her emotional display, allowing her voice to crack at specific moments while maintaining clear articulation, letting tears well up without losing her train of thought. This wasn't performance. It was masterful emotional calibration that allowed her message to land with maximum impact. Back in the investor meeting, Vanessa was applying similar principles. She had prepared for this moment, understanding that her passion for her company's mission needed to be visible but controlled. As she continued her presentation, she deliberately softened her tone, letting concern for her small business clients color her voice. "Every small business owner who uses our platform has a story," she said, pulling up a slide showing Maria's corner store's dramatic inventory transformation. Maria increased her profit margin by 23% using our system. She's putting her daughter through college with those savings. Vanessa paused, letting the human impact sink in, before shifting to a tone of determined optimism. "We can scale without abandoning these clients. In fact, their success stories are exactly what will attract bigger players to our platform." The expression choice matrix helps us navigate these nuanced decisions about emotional display. It's built on three core questions. What emotion am I feeling? What message do I want to convey? And what level of expression will be most effective in this context? This isn't about calculating every interaction to death. It's about developing an intuitive sense of emotional calibration. Think of it like a mixing board in a recording studio. Sometimes you need to amplify certain emotional elements while moderating others. The key is understanding that you have this control, that you can choose to turn up your enthusiasm during a team celebration while keeping anxiety dialed down during a crisis meeting. For Vanessa, this understanding transformed her leadership style. Where she once swung between explosive outbursts and rigid suppression, she now moved fluidly across the spectrum of expression. Her team noticed the change. "It's like she finally gave us permission to be human," one employee noted, while showing us how to be professional about it. The breakthrough moment came during a particularly challenging board meeting. Instead of hiding her concern about a potential merger, she chose to express it strategically. "I want to be transparent about my reservations," she began, letting her worry show through in her voice before transitioning to a more solution-focused tone. "And I also want to share how I think we can address each one." The board later commented that her balanced approach helped them trust both her emotional intelligence and her business acumen. Your challenge: the expression experiment. For the next 7 days, you'll explore your full range of emotional expression in a controlled, private setting. Each day, choose one emotion you typically suppress or feel uncomfortable expressing. This might be anger, joy, disappointment, or even pride. Find a private space, perhaps your car, an empty room, or during a solitary walk, and experiment with expressing this emotion at different intensities. Start at level 1, barely noticeable, and gradually work your way up to level 10, full expression. Pay attention to how each level feels in your body, what thoughts arise, and where your natural comfort zone lies. The goal isn't to change your typical expression level, but to expand your range of choice. Keep a simple log of your experience, noting. Remember, this isn't about dramatic transformation. It's about expanding your emotional vocabulary so you have more choices in how you express yourself. How will you begin exploring your full range of emotional expression today? Chapter 14. Building Response Resilience. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dojo floor as Master Wei stood before his newest student, a 12-year-old girl named Sarah, whose anxiety about an upcoming tournament had brought her to the brink of quitting. Without saying a word, he led her to the Zen garden behind the dojo where a grove of bamboo swayed in the breeze. "Watch," he instructed, gently bending one of the stalks almost to the ground. When he released it, the bamboo sprang back, perfectly straight and unharmed. "Now watch this," he said, taking a rigid wooden rod and applying the same pressure. With a sharp crack, the rod snapped in two. "Most people think being strong means being rigid, unyielding," Master Wei explained, picking up the broken pieces. "They build walls around their emotions, trying to be immovable. But true strength lies in flexibility, in bending without breaking." Sarah's eyes widened with understanding as she watched the bamboo continuing to sway, adapting to each gust of wind while maintaining its core stability. This principle of response resilience represents a fundamental shift in how we think about emotional strength. Unlike traditional approaches that emphasize control or suppression, response resilience focuses on developing the ability to maintain emotional flexibility under increasing pressure. It's not about being unaffected by challenges. It's about developing the capacity to bend and adapt while maintaining your core stability. Think of your emotional response system like a muscle. Just as physical muscles become stronger through progressive resistance training, your emotional resilience grows through gradually increasing exposure to challenging situations. But here's the key difference. While physical training aims to make muscles more powerful, emotional training aims to make responses more flexible and adaptable. Few people embody this principle more powerfully than world champion surfer Bethany Hamilton. At age 13, Hamilton lost her left arm in a shark attack while surfing off the coast of Kauai. The attack itself lasted only seconds, but the emotional aftermath could have defined her entire life. Instead, Hamilton chose to develop what she later called her flexible response system. "People often ask me how I stayed so strong," Hamilton shared in her autobiography. But strength wasn't about not feeling fear or doubt. It was about learning to move with those emotions rather than being paralyzed by them. Within weeks of the attack, she was back in the water, not because she felt no fear, but because she had learned to bend with it rather than break under its weight. Hamilton's approach to returning to professional surfing provides a masterclass in response resilience. She began with small steps, first just being near the ocean, then paddling in shallow water, gradually building up to larger waves. Each step challenged her emotions without overwhelming them, allowing her response system to adapt and strengthen. The key was never trying to be fearless, she explained. It was about building a new relationship with fear, learning to use it as information rather than letting it use me. Back in the dojo, Master Wei was guiding Sarah through a similar process of building response resilience. He had her start with basic kata forms, focusing not on perfection, but on maintaining fluid movement, even when she made mistakes. "Feel the anxiety," he instructed, "but keep moving with it, like the bamboo in the wind." The pressure testing protocol. I've developed builds on these principles, offering a systematic approach to strengthening emotional resilience. Unlike exposure therapy, which often focuses on desensitization, this protocol emphasizes maintaining flexibility under gradually increasing pressure. The goal isn't to eliminate emotional responses, but to expand your capacity to work with them effectively. Sarah's first competition provided a perfect opportunity to put these principles into practice. Instead of trying to eliminate her anxiety, Master Wei taught her to transform it into focused energy. "Anxiety and excitement feel very similar in your body," he explained. "The difference lies in how you respond to those sensations." He showed her how to use her pre-competition jitters to sharpen her awareness, treating each butterfly in her stomach as a sign that her body was preparing for peak performance. The results weren't instant. Transformation never is. But as Sarah moved through her routine, something remarkable happened. When she stumbled slightly during a complex sequence, instead of freezing up as she would have before, she flowed into the next movement like bamboo bending in the wind. She didn't win first place that day, but she achieved something far more valuable. She discovered her capacity for response resilience. Your challenge, the resilience ladder. Over the next 5 days, you'll build your response resilience through progressive emotional challenge exposure. Start by identifying 5 situations in your daily life that trigger emotional responses, ranging from mildly challenging to significantly difficult. Arrange these situations in order from least to most challenging. This is your resilience ladder. Beginning with the easiest situation, spend 1 day mindfully engaging with that level of challenge. Pay attention to your emotional responses without trying to change them. Notice how your body feels, what thoughts arise, and most importantly, practice maintaining flexibility rather than rigidity in your response. Each day, move up 1 level on your ladder, documenting your experiences and insights. Focus particularly on moments when you feel yourself starting to become rigid. These are your opportunities to practice bending rather than breaking. Remember, the goal isn't to eliminate emotional responses, but to expand your capacity to work with them effectively. By the end of the 5 days, you'll have a clear map of your emotional response patterns and practical experience in maintaining flexibility under varying levels of pressure. How will you begin building your response resilience today? Chapter 15. The High-Stakes Toolbox. The red emergency line flashed at precisely 2:47 a.m. Dr. Sarah Kim's hand hovered over the phone for a fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in the practiced pause she'd developed over years of crisis negotiation. That brief moment allowed her to center herself, preparing for whatever chaos awaited on the other end of the line. When she answered, the dispatcher's voice was tight with tension. Hostage situation at First Memorial Hospital. Armed individual in the pediatric ward. As she processed this information, Dr. Kim felt her own pulse quicken. But instead of fighting this natural response, she acknowledged it, using it to sharpen her focus. Years of experience had taught her that emotional awareness in high-stakes situations wasn't about suppressing natural reactions, but about channeling them productively. She knew the next few hours would test every emotional management tool in her arsenal. This scenario illustrates a crucial truth about emotional mastery. The highest stakes often come with the highest emotional pressure. Yet it's precisely in these moments that we need our emotional clarity the most. This is where the high-stakes response system comes into play, a comprehensive framework for maintaining emotional effectiveness when the pressure is most intense. Think of your emotional response system like an emergency protocol. It needs to be both robust and flexible enough to handle unexpected challenges while maintaining core functionality. The key lies not in eliminating emotional responses, which is neither possible nor desirable, but in developing a systematic approach to working with them effectively under pressure. Few examples better illustrate this principle than Captain Chesley "Sully" Sullenberger's remarkable handling of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the Miracle on the Hudson. When both engines failed shortly after takeoff, Sullenberger had just 208 seconds to make decisions that would determine the fate of 155 people. What's fascinating isn't just the technical skill he displayed, but the extraordinary emotional management that made those skills accessible under extreme pressure. In his subsequent interviews and writings, Sullenberger revealed how he maintained emotional clarity during those crucial minutes. Fear was present, he admitted, but it was compartmentalized. I had learned through years of training that emotions are like instruments on a dashboard. They provide vital information, but you can't let them take the controls. Sullenberger's approach during those 208 seconds demonstrated what I call the clear protocol. Center, listen, evaluate, act, review. He began by centering himself, even as alarms blared in the cockpit. He listened to both his instruments and his intuition, evaluated his options systematically, acted decisively, and continuously reviewed the situation's evolving dynamics. This wasn't just good piloting. It was masterful emotional management under extreme pressure. Back in the Crisis Negotiation Center, Dr. Kim was implementing her own version of the CLEAR protocol. As she received updates about the hospital situation, she began with centering, taking 3 controlled breaths while absorbing the initial information. She listened not just to the words being relayed, but to the emotional undertones that might provide crucial insights. Her evaluation phase involved rapidly processing multiple scenarios while maintaining emotional equilibrium. The CLEAR protocol isn't just for life and death situations. It's a versatile framework that can be scaled to any high-pressure scenario. Whether you're facing a crucial business presentation, a difficult family conversation, or an unexpected crisis, the principles remain the same. Center yourself to establish emotional stability. Listen actively to gather complete information. Evaluate options while maintaining clarity. Act decisively when the moment demands, and review continuously to adapt as situations evolve. As Dr. Kim engaged with the hospital situation, she demonstrated how these principles work in real time. When the armed individual became agitated, she maintained her center, using her own emotional stability to help regulate the situation. She listened beyond the angry words to understand the underlying pain driving the behavior. Her evaluation remained clear and systematic, even as the stakes intensified. After 4 tense hours, Dr. Kim successfully negotiated a peaceful resolution. Later, during her debrief, she noted how the high-stakes response system had allowed her to maintain emotional clarity throughout the crisis. In these situations, she explained to her team, emotional control isn't about being cold or detached. It's about maintaining the right balance of engagement and stability. Every emotion contains valuable information if we know how to use it. Your challenge, the Stakes Simulator. Over the next week, you'll build your own high-stakes emotional management toolkit using the CLEAR protocol. Start with relatively low-pressure situations and gradually work your way up to more challenging scenarios. Each day, choose one situation to apply the protocol. Day 1. Apply CLEAR to a minor daily frustration, like traffic or a long checkout line. Day 2. Use it during a slightly challenging work or family interaction. Day 3. Implement it during a planned difficult conversation. Day 4. Apply it to a significant personal or professional challenge. Day 5. Use it in your most challenging regular life situation. For each situation, document how you centered yourself, what you discovered by listening more deeply, how you evaluated your options, what actions you took, what your review revealed about your response. Remember, the goal isn't perfection, it's progress. Each application of the protocol builds your capacity for emotional clarity under pressure. How will you begin building your high-stakes emotional toolkit today? Chapter 16. Emotional Mastery in Relationships. The words hung in the air like storm clouds. Maria could feel the familiar surge of defensiveness rising, but this time, something was different. Her husband Carlos's criticism about her constant work schedule would normally trigger an immediate counterattack about his own imperfections. Instead, she found herself pausing, noticing the pain beneath his words. As both a relationship therapist and a wife, Maria Delgado was experiencing a profound moment of disconnect between her professional knowledge and personal practice. Sitting in her home office after another tense exchange with Carlos, Maria reflected on the irony of her situation. She spent her days guiding couples through their emotional storms, yet here she was, struggling to navigate her own relationship waters. The certificates on her wall seemed to mock her, 20 years of professional expertise that somehow evaporated when facing her own marital challenges. This scenario illuminates a crucial truth about emotional responses in intimate relationships. They operate on a fundamentally different level than our everyday emotional reactions. When we're triggered by a stranger or colleague, we're dealing with surface-level emotions. But when our intimate partner triggers us, we're activating deep emotional patterns that often trace back to our earliest experiences of love and attachment. The relationship response framework emerged from this understanding. Unlike general emotional management techniques, this framework acknowledges the unique complexity of intimate relationships. When your partner speaks, you're not just hearing their words, You're hearing them through layers of shared history, unspoken expectations, and deep-seated attachment needs. This is why conventional emotional management techniques often fall short in our closest relationships. Think of your emotional responses in intimate relationships like a complex dance. Each partner moves not just in response to the present moment, but in patterns established through years of interaction. These patterns become so ingrained that we often react without conscious awareness, perpetuating cycles that can either strengthen or strain our connections. Will Smith's journey with emotional growth in his relationship with Jada Pinkett Smith provides a compelling illustration of these principles in action. In his memoir and subsequent interviews, Smith candidly shared his struggle to break free from reactive patterns in his marriage. Despite his success and confidence in other areas of life, he found himself trapped in emotional reactions that threatened his most important relationship. "I had to learn that my wife's criticism wasn't an attack on my character," Smith revealed in a particularly candid interview. "I was reacting to old wounds, old stories about not being enough. When I learned to pause and really hear what was beneath her words, everything changed." This insight mirrors a core principle of the relationship response framework, the understanding that our strongest triggers often come from our deepest vulnerabilities. Smith's journey highlighted how even seemingly confident, successful individuals can struggle with emotional reactions in intimate relationships. His breakthrough came when he began practicing what we call connection before correction, a technique that prioritizes maintaining emotional presence over proving a point or defending a position. Back in Maria's story, she began to see how her professional knowledge needed translation into personal practice. During another evening discussion with Carlos, when he again brought up her work schedule, she tried something new. Instead of immediately defending her choices or counterattacking, she practiced connection before correction. She paused, took a breath, and really listened to the emotion beneath his complaint. "I hear how much you miss our time together," she said, maintaining eye contact instead of planning her defense. This simple shift, prioritizing connection over correction, created a momentary bridge across their emotional divide. Carlos's tension visibly softened, and for the first time in months, they began having a real conversation instead of another argument. The connection. Before correction technique operates on 3 levels: physical, emotional, and verbal. Physically, it involves maintaining an open posture and conscious breathing when triggered. Emotionally, it requires acknowledging your own reactive impulses while choosing to stay present with your partner's experience. Verbally, it means responding first to the emotional content of your partner's communication before addressing any practical issues. This technique proves particularly powerful because it addresses what couples therapist Dr. Sue Johnson calls the demon dialogues, those circular arguments that seem to go nowhere because they're driven by attachment fears rather than the surface issue being discussed. When we can recognize these deeper patterns, we gain the power to respond differently. Maria's journey of applying these principles in her own marriage led to unexpected insights for her practice. She began to understand on a visceral level why knowledge alone isn't enough to transform relationship patterns. During one session with a struggling couple, she shared her own experience of learning to pause before reacting, and the authenticity of her personal struggle created a breakthrough moment for her clients. The transformation in Maria's marriage didn't happen overnight. It required consistent practice and plenty of missteps along the way. But as she developed her capacity to pause before reacting, she noticed subtle shifts in her relationship's emotional climate. Carlos began responding differently too, as if her changed responses were creating space for new patterns to emerge. One evening, after successfully navigating what would have previously been a major argument, Maria sat in her office updating her client notes. She realized that her personal struggles had deepened her professional understanding in ways that no amount of training could have achieved. The certificates on her wall no longer seemed to mock her. Instead, they represented just one part of her ongoing journey toward emotional mastery in relationships. The most profound insight came during a weekend when both she and Carlos were stressed about competing family obligations. In the past, this would have led to a heated argument about priorities and fairness. Instead, they found themselves able to acknowledge both their individual triggers and their shared desire for connection. This wasn't just conflict resolution, It was a fundamental shift in how they related to each other during challenging moments. Your challenge: the partner pause practice. Over the next 3 days, you'll implement a structured practice to transform one specific trigger in your intimate relationships. This isn't about achieving perfection. It's about developing new patterns, one response at a time. First, identify one common trigger in your relationship. A specific type of situation that reliably produces a reactive response in you. This might be criticism about a particular topic, a certain tone of voice, or a recurring disagreement. For the next 3 days, whenever this trigger arises, practice the following sequence. Day 1. Focus on the physical aspect of your response. Notice where you feel the trigger in your body. Practice maintaining an open posture and conscious breathing when triggered. Day 2. Add emotional awareness to your practice. Notice your immediate emotional reaction without acting on it. Try to identify the deeper feeling beneath your partner's words or actions. Day 3. Implement the full connection. Before correction technique. Respond first to the emotional content of your partner's communication before addressing any practical issues. Each evening, document your experience. What was your internal experience during the trigger moment? How did your partner respond to your new approach? What did you learn about your patterns and possibilities for change? Remember, this practice isn't about suppressing your own needs or emotions. It's about creating space for deeper understanding and connection. How will you begin transforming your relationship patterns today? Chapter 17. Creating your response ritual. The pre-dawn silence at the Olympic training facility was broken only by the gentle lapping of pool water against tiles. Michael stood at the edge of the pool, his shadow stretching long across the surface in the dim light. It was 4:30 a.m., and while most of Beijing slept, the Olympic swimmer began his daily ritual, not with a dive, but with 3 deliberate breaths. His hands moved through a precise sequence of gestures, each one accumulated through years of refinement. To an outsider, these small movements might seem insignificant, even superstitious. But for Michael, they were the anchors that would hold him steady through the storms of competition. The water's surface reflected the overhead lights, creating a dance of shadows that matched the rhythm of his breathing. As he moved through his sequence, 3 breaths, right hand to heart, left hand extending outward, Michael reflected on how far this ritual had carried him. From panic attacks before high school meets to Olympic trials, these simple movements had become his emotional compass, pointing him towards stability, no matter how rough the waters became. When we face high-pressure situations, our emotional responses often seem beyond our control, like waves that crash over us without warning. But beneath the surface of exceptional performance lies a truth that champions across disciplines have discovered. Our emotional states can be programmed through deliberate ritual. This isn't about superstition or rigid routine. It's about creating reliable pathways to emotional stability through consistent practice. Ritual response programming works because it bypasses the conscious mind's tendency to overthink and overanalyze. By establishing specific sequences of actions tied to desired emotional states, we create neural pathways that automatically trigger positive responses. Think of it like installing emotional software. Once programmed, these rituals run automatically in the background, maintaining stability even under pressure. The science behind this approach reveals something fascinating about human psychology. When we repeat a specific sequence of actions consistently, especially with conscious intention, our brains begin to associate that sequence with particular emotional states. This isn't just habit formation, it's the deliberate creation of emotional anchors that can hold us steady in any storm. Forrest Whitaker's journey with emotional preparation rituals provides a masterclass in this approach. When preparing for his Oscar-winning role as Idi Amin in The Last King of Scotland, Whitaker faced an unprecedented challenge: how to access the complex emotional landscape of a historical figure known for both charisma and brutality. His solution was to develop specific emotional preparation rituals for different aspects of the character. "I created a morning ritual that would help me access Amin's public persona," Whitaker shared in a rare interview about his process. "It involves specific movements, listening to particular music from Uganda, and a sequence of breathing exercises. But I had a different ritual for scenes showing his private moments, his vulnerabilities. This dual ritual approach allowed Whitaker to navigate the character's emotional complexity while maintaining his own psychological well-being. The power of Whitaker's approach lay in its specificity. He didn't just create general preparation routines, he designed distinct rituals for different emotional requirements. This level of intentional ritual design demonstrates a key principle. The more specific and purposeful the ritual, the more reliable its emotional outcome. Back at the Olympic training facility, Michael continued his pre-dawn sequence. As his hands moved through their practiced patterns, his breathing synchronized with the movement. Each gesture carried years of emotional memory, moments of triumph, moments of defeat, all woven into a tapestry of experience that the ritual could access in an instant. The personal ritual design protocol emerged from studying such high performers across fields. It begins with identifying specific emotional states needed for peak performance, then building deliberate sequences of actions that reliably produce those states. The key lies in starting small. Trying to create elaborate rituals often leads to abandonment. Instead, successful ritual design builds complexity gradually, allowing each element to cement itself in both body and mind. Michael's morning took an unexpected turn when his coach arrived with news that would test his emotional anchors. A last-minute change in the competition schedule meant he would be swimming his key event several hours earlier than planned. In the past, such disruption might have triggered a spiral of anxiety, but as the news landed, Michael simply returned to his ritual, letting the familiar movements guide him back to center. This is where the true power of ritual response programming reveals itself. When we've properly installed these emotional programs, they work even, and especially, when circumstances deviate from our expectations. The ritual becomes not just a preparation tool, but a reset button we can press whenever needed. Through the next hour, as other swimmers arrived and the facility hummed to life, Michael maintained his emotional stability through micro-versions of his ritual. Between practice laps, during brief rests, his hands would move through abbreviated versions of his sequence, each time reinforcing his programmed response of calm focus. The competition that day became a testament to the power of ritual. Despite the schedule change, despite the pressure of Olympic trials, Michael's performance remained steady. Not his best time, but far from his worst. And more importantly, he maintained his emotional equilibrium throughout, allowing him to analyze and learn from the experience, rather than being overwhelmed by it. The key insight from Michael's experience wasn't about the specific gestures or sequences he used. It was about the principle of emotional programming through consistent ritual. His morning routine had created a foundation of stability that supported him through uncertainty and challenge. This wasn't about controlling emotions, but about creating reliable pathways to desired emotional states. This brings us to a crucial understanding about emotional management. It's not about suppressing or controlling our feelings, but about creating reliable ways to access helpful emotional states when we need them most. Ritual response programming offers a systematic approach to building these emotional access points into our daily lives. Your challenge: the Mini Ritual Challenge. Over the next 7 days, you'll design and implement a simple 2-minute morning ritual focused on emotional centering. This isn't about creating the perfect routine immediately. It's about starting small and building consistency. Begin by choosing 3 simple elements: a physical gesture, like placing your hand over your heart, a breathing pattern, such as 3 deep breaths, and a brief mental focus, such as visualizing a peaceful scene or repeating a meaningful phrase. Each morning, perform your chosen sequence immediately upon waking. Keep a small notebook by your bed to track 2 things: your emotional state before the ritual and your state immediately after. Note any variations or insights that arise. After 3 days, evaluate which elements of your ritual feel most impactful. You may adjust one element at a time, but maintain consistency with the others. The goal isn't perfection, but understanding how different ritual elements affect your emotional baseline. Pay particular attention to how your ritual-enhanced emotional baseline influences your responses to the day's first challenges. Does your morning commute feel different? Do you respond to early work emails with greater equilibrium? Remember, The power of ritual lies not in its complexity, but in its consistency. How will you begin programming your emotional responses today? Chapter 18. The Power of Proactive Emotions. The fluorescent lights of the neuroscience lab cast a sterile glow as Dr. Robert Chang stared at his computer screen, his expression shifting from confusion to revelation. The data scrolling before him challenged everything he thought he knew about emotional responses. After analyzing thousands of participant reactions across diverse scenarios, a striking pattern emerged. 89% of emotional reactions followed predictable pathways. What appeared as spontaneous emotional outbursts were, in fact, the culmination of identifiable triggers and established neural patterns. Robert pushed back from his desk, memories flooding back of the countless times his own emotional reactions had seemed beyond his control. Just last month, he'd snapped at a promising graduate student over a minor protocol breach, nearly derailing months of research. That moment had catalyzed his current study, but now he realized something profound. That outburst, like most emotional reactions, could have been anticipated and prevented. The implications of this discovery stretched far beyond the sterile confines of his lab. If most emotional reactions follow predictable patterns, then the key to emotional mastery isn't just about managing reactions as they occur. It's about anticipating and preparing for them before they arise. This insight forms the foundation of emotional forecasting, a revolutionary approach to emotional intelligence that shifts our focus from reaction to preparation. Think of your emotional landscape like a weather system. Just as meteorologists can predict storms by analyzing atmospheric conditions, we can learn to forecast our emotional responses by understanding our personal triggers and patterns. This isn't about crystal ball gazing. It's about developing a sophisticated understanding of your emotional climate and preparing accordingly. The science behind emotional forecasting reveals something remarkable about human behavior. Our brains are constantly making predictions about our environment, including how we might feel in future situations. By consciously engaging with this predictive capacity, we can actually shape our emotional responses before they occur, creating what neuroscientists call preemptive emotional regulation. Taylor Swift's evolution in handling public criticism provides a masterful example of emotional forecasting in action. Early in her career, Swift often found herself reactive to media narratives, responding to criticism after the fact. But as her profile grew, she developed a revolutionary approach she calls writing the narrative before others can. "I realized that letting others define my story meant always playing defense," Swift shared in a revealing interview. "So I started anticipating potential criticisms and addressing them proactively in my work. This strategy wasn't just about controlling the narrative, it was about emotional preparation. By anticipating potential emotional triggers, Swift could prepare measured responses rather than reacting in the heat of the moment." Her approach became particularly evident with the release of Reputation, an album that preemptively addressed potential criticisms and transformed them into creative fuel. Instead of being blindsided by public perception, Swift had already processed and responded to potential emotional triggers through her art. This wasn't just clever marketing, it was sophisticated emotional forecasting at work. The power of Swift's approach lay in its proactive nature. Rather than waiting for emotional storms to hit, she learned to read the atmospheric conditions and prepare accordingly. This same principle can be applied to any area of life where emotions play a crucial role, from professional challenges to personal relationships. Back in the research lab, Dr. Chang began implementing these insights with his team. He created what he called emotional weather maps, detailed analyses of situations that typically triggered strong reactions among his researchers. By identifying these potential hotspots in advance, the team could prepare strategies for maintaining composure during critical experiments. The proactive response map emerged from this work, offering a systematic approach to emotional preparation. The process begins with identifying potential trigger points in your immediate future, upcoming meetings, challenging conversations, or stressful events. For each scenario, you map out not just what might trigger you, but why, and most importantly, how you want to respond. Robert watched as his lab's atmosphere transformed. The The graduate student who had once been on the receiving end of his frustration was now thriving under a new system where potential conflicts were addressed before they could escalate. Weekly team meetings began with brief emotional forecasting sessions, where researchers would identify upcoming challenges and develop collective strategies for maintaining composure. This approach proved particularly valuable during a critical phase of their research when equipment failures threatened months of work. Instead of the usual panic and blame shifting that often accompanies such setbacks, the team had already anticipated this possibility and had both practical and emotional contingency plans in place. The key insight from the lab's transformation wasn't just about preventing negative reactions. It was about creating an environment where emotional intelligence could flourish proactively rather than reactively. By anticipating emotional challenges, the team could channel their energy into solutions rather than damage control. One particularly striking example came during a high-stakes presentation to potential research donors. In the past, such events had been sources of immense stress, often leading to performance anxiety and communication breakdowns. But using the proactive response map, the team identified potential emotional triggers, from technical glitches to challenging questions, and prepared not just their responses, but their emotional approach to each scenario. The presentation wasn't perfect. No amount of preparation can eliminate all uncertainty. But the team's ability to maintain composure through challenges proved more impressive to donors than flawless delivery would have been. They secured their funding not despite the obstacles they faced, but partly because of how skillfully they navigated them. Your challenge: tomorrow's emotions. Today, exercise. For the next 7 days, commit to spending 5 minutes each evening mapping out potential emotional challenges for the following day. This isn't about trying to predict every possible scenario, but about developing your emotional forecasting muscles. Start by identifying 3 potential situations that might trigger strong emotions tomorrow. These could be as simple as a morning commute or as complex as a difficult conversation you need to have. For each situation, write down the specific triggers you might encounter, your typical emotional response in similar situations, your ideal response, how you'd like to handle the situation, a simple strategy or reminder to help bridge the gap between typical and ideal responses. Each morning, review your emotional forecast briefly before starting your day. As you encounter the situations you predicted, notice how awareness and preparation influence your responses. Pay particular attention to any unpredicted triggers that arise. These will help refine your forecasting ability. At the end of each day, take a moment to reflect on the accuracy of your emotional forecast and the effectiveness of your prepared responses. Were there situations you didn't anticipate? How did your awareness of potential triggers affect your actual responses? Remember, the goal isn't perfect prediction, but better preparation. How will you begin forecasting your emotional weather today? Chapter 19: Navigating Emotional Storms. Like a seasoned sailor reading the horizon, Amanda Foster could sense the emotional storm gathering inside her during the high-stakes merger negotiation. Her jaw tightened as she watched the CEO's face redden with each passing minute. The conference room's tension was as thick as storm clouds, and she knew from experience that lightning was about to strike. But instead of bracing for impact, she found herself doing something unexpected. She was studying the patterns of this approaching emotional tempest with curious detachment. The mahogany conference table stretched between 2 teams of executives, their bodies rigid with unspoken hostility. Amanda had mediated hundreds of corporate negotiations, but this one felt different. The acquiring company's aggressive stance was triggering her own deep-seated reactions to bullying, a pattern she'd experienced since childhood. Yet, rather than allowing this emotional weather system to overwhelm her, she began to track its movement with the precision of a meteorologist. She noticed how her shoulders tensed first, the equivalent of distant thunder. Then came the quickening of her breath, like wind picking up before a storm. These weren't just random physical responses. They were part of a predictable pattern she had learned to read, like atmospheric pressure changes. This awareness didn't make the emotions disappear, but it transformed them from threatening forces into navigable weather systems. Just as meteorologists understand that every storm follows certain physical laws, our emotional upheavals adhere to predictable patterns. This insight forms the foundation of the Storm Navigation Protocol, a systematic approach to understanding and working with our emotional weather rather than against it. Think of your emotions not as chaotic disruptions, but as natural phenomena with their own logic and life cycle. The protocol emerged from studying how people who maintain exceptional emotional equilibrium handle intense situations. These individuals don't try to suppress or control their emotional storms. Instead, they've learned to read the weather signs and navigate accordingly. This approach revolutionizes our relationship with difficult emotions, transforming them from enemies to be fought into weather systems to be navigated. Every emotional storm follows a pattern similar to its meteorological counterpart. There's the gathering of conditions, the triggers and circumstances that set the stage. Then comes the building intensity, the physical and mental signs that signal approaching turbulence. The peak intensity follows, what sailors call the eye of the storm, where emotions reach their strongest point. Finally, there's the natural dissolution, the clearing that always follows, though its timing may vary. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean eliminating emotional storms. That would be like trying to prevent weather itself. Instead, it's about developing the skills to navigate through them while maintaining your core stability. This approach acknowledges that emotional intensity is not just inevitable, but often necessary for growth and transformation. Matthew McConaughey's career transformation offers a masterful example of emotional weather navigation. When he decided to transition from romantic comedies to more serious dramatic roles, he faced not just external skepticism, but intense internal emotional storms. The journey that led to his Oscar-winning performance in Dallas Buyers Club required navigating through periods of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. "I had to learn to get comfortable with being uncomfortable," McConaughey shared in his memoir Green Lights. He described developing what he called his emotional weather map, a deep understanding of his internal climate patterns. During the dramatic weight loss required for Dallas Buyers Club, he faced daily emotional turbulence. Rather than fighting against these storms of doubt and physical discomfort, he learned to track them, understand their patterns, and use their energy to fuel his performance. McConaughey's approach wasn't about maintaining constant calm. It was about understanding the weather patterns of his emotional journey. He noticed how morning anxiety would peak and then naturally subside, how physical exhaustion triggered emotional vulnerability, and how these patterns could be used rather than resisted. This understanding allowed him to navigate through the transformation while maintaining his artistic focus. The weather method emerged from studying such successful navigation strategies. Watch involves developing awareness of approaching emotional storms through early warning signs. Evaluate means assessing the type and intensity of the emotional weather system building. Acknowledge accepts the presence of the storm without trying to fight it. Track follows the storm's movement and patterns. Harbor creates a stable internal anchor point during peak intensity. Emerge guides the process of moving through the storm's natural clearing. Reflect learns from each weather event to better prepare for future ones. Back in the conference room, Amanda found herself applying these principles in real time. As the CEO's accusations grew more heated, she noticed her own emotional barometer rising. Instead of immediately intervening or suppressing her reactions, she tracked the weather pattern developing in the room. The tension was building like a pressure system, and she could see similar signs in both negotiating teams: clenched fists, tightened jaw muscles, defensive postures. Drawing on her understanding of emotional weather patterns, Amanda recognized this as the gathering stage of a storm. Rather than trying to prevent it, she focused on navigation. She adjusted her breathing to create a stable harbor within herself, then began guiding both teams through the turbulence with weather-aware techniques. "I notice we're entering some choppy waters," she said, her voice steady as a lighthouse beam. "Let's track this together." This simple acknowledgement of the emotional weather had an immediate effect. The CEO's rigid posture softened slightly. Someone had finally named the atmospheric conditions everyone was feeling. Over the next hour, Amanda guided the negotiation using her understanding of emotional weather patterns. When tension peaked, she knew it would naturally subside if navigated correctly. She helped both teams track their emotional weather together, turning potential conflict into collaborative navigation. The breakthrough came not from avoiding the storm, but from navigating through it skillfully. As the emotional weather began to clear, both teams found themselves in a new space of possibility. The merger terms were renegotiated with a level of mutual understanding that wouldn't have been possible without weathering the storm together. Later, reflecting on the session, Amanda realized how far she'd come from her early days of trying to prevent or control emotional storms. She now understood that these weather systems weren't obstacles to success. They were often the very forces that, when navigated skillfully, could drive positive transformation. Your storm tracker exercise. Over the next 5 days, become the meteorologist of your emotional weather. Each day, choose one emotional storm to track from beginning to end. This could be anything from mild anxiety about a meeting to intense frustration with a challenging situation. For each emotional weather event, first, identify the gathering conditions. What early warning signs tell you a storm is approaching? Notice physical sensations, thought patterns, and environmental triggers. Track the storm's development. How does the intensity build? What patterns do you notice in your thoughts, feelings, and physical responses? Observe the peak intensity without trying to change it. Like a meteorologist studying a storm's eye, maintain curious awareness of your strongest emotional weather. Document the natural resolution pattern. How does the storm begin to clear? What signs indicate the weather is changing? Note any after effects, just as meteorologists track how a storm system influences subsequent weather patterns. Pay special attention to your navigation strategies. What helps you maintain stability during emotional turbulence? Which responses seem to intensify or prolong the storm? Each evening, spend a few minutes reflecting on the day's emotional weather patterns. What did you learn about your personal weather systems? How might this understanding help you navigate future storms? Remember, the goal isn't to prevent emotional storms, but to become skilled at navigating through them. How will you use your growing weather wisdom to sail through your next emotional tempest? Chapter 20. Advanced Response Techniques. The steady beep of monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop as Dr. James Wilson's hands moved with practiced precision through the intricate chest procedure. What made this surgery remarkable wasn't its complexity, though repairing a torn aorta certainly qualified, but rather the circumstances surrounding it. Through the operating room's windows, orange flames flickered from the adjacent building, and overhead speakers repeatedly announced evacuation protocols for non-essential personnel. "Dr. Wilson, fire department says we have 20 minutes to evacuate," a nurse announced, her voice tight with anxiety. The surgeon didn't look up from his work, his breath remaining as steady as his hands. The patient's chest lay open before him, each heartbeat visible, each moment critical. The room's tension was palpable, yet Wilson maintained an almost supernatural composure. "We'll need 17, he replied, his voice carrying the same calm authority it held during routine procedures. "Please inform them we're closing now." The contrast between the chaos outside and the focused serenity he maintained created an almost surreal atmosphere in the operating room. His team watched in amazement as he continued working with methodical precision, his movements neither hurried nor delayed, despite the growing emergency. Advanced response architecture represents the pinnacle of emotional management, a sophisticated framework for maintaining peak performance under extreme pressure. Unlike basic emotional control techniques, this approach doesn't just manage reactions. It builds a comprehensive internal structure that can withstand increasingly intense challenges while maintaining optimal function. Think of it as the difference between a simple shelter and a modern skyscraper. Both provide protection, but the skyscraper's advanced engineering allows it to remain stable even during severe storms or earthquakes. Similarly, advanced response architecture creates a robust internal framework that not only handles immediate pressures, but actually becomes stronger through exposure to challenges. This system emerged from studying individuals who consistently perform at elite levels under extreme pressure. These people don't just cope with stress, they harness it to enhance their performance. They've developed what might be called an emotional exoskeleton, a sophisticated internal structure that transforms pressure from a destabilizing force into a performance catalyst. Admiral William McRaven's journey provides a masterful example of advanced response architecture in action. During his 37-year career as a Navy SEAL, including his role as commander of all U.S. Special Operations Forces, McRaven developed and refined emotional management techniques that went far beyond basic stress control. His experiences, from leading the operation that resulted in the capture of Saddam Hussein to overseeing the raid that led to Osama bin Laden's death, required unprecedented levels of emotional equilibrium. What distinguished McRaven's approach was its architectural sophistication. He didn't just develop techniques for handling pressure, he built an internal framework that actually utilized pressure to enhance performance. In his book Sea Stories, McRaven describes how SEAL training taught him to construct what he calls pressure channels, mental pathways that direct stress energy into focused action rather than letting it dissipate into anxiety or fear. The key isn't to eliminate pressure, McRaven explains, but to build internal structures that transform it into fuel for performance. He describes how during critical operations, he would consciously engage what he termed his pressure conversion system, a sophisticated mental framework that processed incoming stress through a series of established channels, each designed to convert potential emotional disruption into enhanced focus and capability. Perhaps most remarkably, McRaven successfully translated these military-grade emotional management techniques to civilian leadership roles, demonstrating their universal applicability. As Chancellor of the University of Texas system, he applied the same advanced response architecture to handle academic politics and institutional challenges, proving these sophisticated approaches work across all high-pressure environments. The Pressure Point Protocol builds on these insights, offering a systematic approach to developing your own advanced response architecture. This isn't just about handling stress, it's about building an internal framework that transforms pressure into performance enhancement. The protocol operates through three sophisticated mechanisms: pressure conversion, response amplification, and structural integration. Dr. Wilson had spent years developing his advanced response architecture, though he wouldn't have used that term early in his career. As a junior surgeon, he'd struggled with the intense pressures of emergency medicine. Each critical case would flood his system with adrenaline, making his hands shake at precisely the moments they needed to be steadiest. The turning point came when he realized that fighting against pressure was far less effective than building internal structures to channel it. Back in the operating room, Wilson's advanced response architecture was being tested to its limits. The smell of smoke had become noticeable, and the evacuation announcements were now continuous. Yet within his carefully constructed internal framework, these pressures didn't register as threats. They were simply data points being processed through established channels. "Kelly, would you check the patient's coagulation values?" Wilson asked, his voice maintaining its steady cadence. The nurse moved quickly to comply, her own anxiety noticeably decreasing as she fell into sync with his composed rhythm. This was another sophisticated aspect of advanced response architecture, its ability to create stability fields that influence others' emotional states. The procedure continued with remarkable precision, each team member gradually aligning with Wilson's stable energy field. When the final suture was placed, exactly 16 minutes had elapsed. As they transported the patient to safety, several team members remarked that it was the most focused surgery they'd ever participated in, despite, or perhaps because of, the extreme circumstances. Later that week, Wilson gathered his surgical team for a detailed discussion of the experience. He began systematically sharing the components of his advanced response architecture, breaking down how he developed his sophisticated pressure management framework. The team was surprised to learn that what had appeared as natural calm was actually the result of carefully constructed internal systems. "The key," Wilson explained, "isn't to become immune to pressure, but to build internal structures that transform it into enhanced performance capability." He began teaching them the Pressure Point Protocol, starting with basic pressure conversion techniques and progressively moving toward more sophisticated emotional management structures. The transformation in his team was remarkable. Over the following months, their collective performance in high-pressure situations showed consistent improvement. They learned to build their own advanced response architectures, each customized to their individual needs, but following the same core principles of pressure conversion and structural integration. The Advanced Response Challenge offers you the opportunity to begin building your own sophisticated emotional management framework. Over the next week, you'll progress through 3 levels of practice, each building upon the previous one to create a robust internal architecture for handling pressure. Start with foundation practice. For the first 2 days, spend 10 minutes each morning doing progressive breath work. Begin with basic deep breathing, then gradually introduce complexity by adding counted intervals and holding patterns. Pay particular attention to the moments when your breathing wants to speed up or become irregular. These are opportunities to strengthen your foundation. Move to structure building. Days 3 and 4 focus on constructing your initial pressure channels. During everyday stress moments, a tight deadline, a difficult conversation, an unexpected problem, consciously direct the pressure through your breath patterns. Notice how the energy changes as it moves through these intentional pathways. Document each experience, noting what works and what needs refinement. Advance to integration practice. The final 3 days involve sophisticated emotional reframing exercises. When you encounter pressure situations, engage your full advanced response architecture. Use your breath foundation to activate your pressure channels, then consciously reframe the energy as performance fuel. Pay attention to how your internal structures handle increasing pressure levels. For each practice session, maintain a detailed response journal. Note the specific techniques you're using, how your internal architecture responds to different types of pressure, and any patterns you observe in your pressure conversion process. The goal isn't perfection, it's progressive development of your emotional management capabilities. Remember, you're not just learning techniques, you're building a sophisticated internal framework that will serve you in every high-pressure situation you encounter. How will you use this advanced response architecture to transform pressure into performance in your own life? Chapter 21. Building your emotional shield. The mahogany-paneled boardroom crackled with tension as Lisa, CEO of Horizon Technologies, faced down 12 stern faces. The hostile takeover bid from rival tech giant NetherCorp had caught many by surprise, but Lisa's composure remained unshaken. Her dark eyes swept the room with quiet confidence as she absorbed the aggressive questioning from board members, some of whom she'd considered allies just days before. "Lisa, how do you explain the 15% drop in share value since rumors of this takeover began?" demanded Richard Kensington, a longtime board member whose loyalty had mysteriously shifted in recent weeks. The question was designed to wound, to expose vulnerability. Instead of flinching, Lisa allowed a moment of silence to fill the room. "The market reacts to uncertainty, Richard," she replied, her voice steady and warm despite the hostility directed her way. "What matters isn't the temporary fluctuation, but the underlying strength of our innovation pipeline and customer relationships." She didn't just deflect the attack, she transformed it into an opportunity to showcase the company's resilience. The scene unfolding in that boardroom represented something far more significant than just corporate politics. It demonstrated the power of what I call shield construction, the art of building emotional protection that preserves both strength and humanity. This isn't about erecting walls or becoming cold. It's about developing a sophisticated defensive system that filters out harmful energy while maintaining authentic connection. Think of emotional shielding like the Earth's atmosphere. Our planet's atmospheric layers don't just block harmful radiation. They create the conditions that allow life to flourish. Similarly, effective emotional shielding doesn't just protect us from negative energy. It creates the safe space needed for genuine engagement and growth. Many people mistakenly believe that emotional protection requires becoming detached or hardened. They build rigid walls that keep out both harm and connection, essentially trading emotional safety for emotional isolation. But true shield construction takes a more nuanced approach, creating selective barriers that filter rather than block, protect rather than isolate. This sophisticated approach to emotional protection finds a powerful example in the journey of Viola Davis. Throughout her career, Davis has faced intense scrutiny, systemic barriers, and personal attacks. Yet she's maintained both her emotional authenticity and her ability to connect deeply with audiences and colleagues. In her memoir, Finding Me, Davis describes how early in her career, she attempted to protect herself by building walls, trying to become impervious to criticism and prejudice. But she discovered that this approach also blocked her ability to access the vulnerable emotions needed for her craft. The breakthrough came when she realized protection didn't mean becoming invulnerable. It meant becoming selectively permeable. I had to learn the difference between shielding and shutting down, Davis writes. Shielding allows you to choose what energy you let in and what you deflect. Shutting down might protect you, but it also imprisons you. This insight led her to develop what she calls her emotional filtration system, a sophisticated approach to managing external pressures while maintaining artistic and personal authenticity. Davis's shield construction became particularly evident during her groundbreaking role in How to Get Away with Murder. Playing Annalise Keating required intense emotional vulnerability on screen, while simultaneously handling unprecedented public scrutiny off-screen. She developed specific techniques for transitioning between these states, protecting her personal energy while remaining fully available for her artistic work. The Shield Strength Training Program builds on these insights, offering a systematic approach to developing your own sophisticated emotional protection. This isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a framework for building customized shields that match your specific needs and circumstances. Back in the boardroom, Lisa demonstrated advanced shield construction in action. As another board member launched into a thinly veiled personal attack, questioning her leadership style, she engaged her protective filters without losing her connection to the room. Her shield wasn't a wall. It was more like a sophisticated energy management system. "I appreciate your concern about my leadership approach, James," she responded, maintaining eye contact and an open posture. "Let's look at how that style has translated into results." She proceeded to guide the conversation away from personal attacks and toward concrete achievements, all while maintaining genuine engagement with every person in the room. What made Lisa's shield particularly effective was its selective permeability. She didn't block out all negative energy. She filtered it, extracting useful information while deflecting harmful intent. When board members raised legitimate concerns about market conditions, she absorbed and addressed them. When they attempted personal attacks, her shield redirected that energy into productive discussion. The Shield Strength Training Program operates through 3 key mechanisms: boundary definition, energy filtration, and connection maintenance. These components work together to create protection that preserves rather than prevents meaningful interaction. Through years of leadership experience, Lisa had refined these mechanisms to an art form. Her shield construction began with clear boundary definition, knowing exactly what she would and wouldn't accept in terms of professional interaction. This clarity allowed her to respond to challenges without becoming defensive. The energy filtration component of her shield worked continuously throughout the board meeting, processing incoming hostility through a sophisticated sorting system. Legitimate business concerns were acknowledged and addressed. Personal attacks were transformed into opportunities for constructive dialogue. Political maneuvering was noted but not engaged with directly. Most importantly, her shield maintained authentic connection throughout the confrontation. Even as she protected herself from hostile energy, she remained genuinely engaged with every person in the room. This wasn't just strategic. It was a fundamental aspect of effective shield construction. As the board meeting reached its crucial moment, Lisa's shield faced its ultimate test. Nethercorp's CEO had arrived unexpectedly, clearly hoping to destabilize the proceedings. Instead of tensing up or retreating behind rigid defenses, Lisa adjusted her shield settings, maintaining protection while opening channels for potential collaboration. "Welcome, Mr. Chen," she said, standing to greet him with genuine warmth despite the circumstances. "Your presence gives us an opportunity to discuss how our companies might work together, rather than against each other." The shift in energy was palpable. What had been designed as an aggressive takeover attempt began transforming into a potential strategic partnership discussion. This demonstration of advanced shield construction changed the entire dynamic of the meeting. Board members who had been hostile moments before found themselves drawn into a more constructive dialogue. Even Richard Kensington, who had led the aggressive questioning, began contributing positive ideas to the emerging discussion. The Shield Practice Challenge invites you to begin developing your own sophisticated emotional protection system. Over the next week, you'll focus on building and refining your shield through daily practical application. Each morning, identify one situation in your upcoming day where you need stronger emotional boundaries. It might be a challenging meeting, a difficult conversation, or even a casual interaction that typically drains your energy. Before entering that situation, take 5 minutes to activate your shield using the following process. First, clearly define your boundaries for that specific interaction. What energy will you allow in? What will you deflect? Be specific about your protection needs while remaining open to genuine connection. Document these boundaries in writing, being as precise as possible about what constitutes acceptable versus unacceptable interaction. As you enter the situation, consciously engage your shield. Pay attention to how different types of energy feel as they encounter your protection. Notice what gets through, what gets deflected, and how your shield affects your ability to maintain authentic connection. Keep mental notes about these interactions for later reflection. After the situation, spend 5 minutes documenting your experience. How did your shield perform? Where was it effective? Where did it need strengthening? Most importantly, how did it affect your ability to maintain genuine engagement while staying protected? Use these insights to refine your shield construction for the next day's practice. Remember, the goal isn't to become invulnerable. It's to develop sophisticated protection that preserves your ability to connect while managing harmful energy effectively. How will you begin building your shield today? Chapter 22. The Art of Long-Term Calm. The Chicago Emergency Dispatch Center's night shift was always intense, a constant stream of crisis calls flooding in from the nation's third-largest city. Yet walking into the facility, you'd never guess the life-and-death nature of the work taking place. The atmosphere was focused but remarkably peaceful, with dispatchers handling everything from minor disturbances to major emergencies with steady composure. At the center of this calm sat Thomas, a 20-year veteran whose presence seemed to radiate tranquility. Even as multiple critical calls lit up his console, his breathing remained steady, his voice clear and reassuring. A new dispatcher watched in amazement as Thomas smoothly coordinated responses to a 5-car pileup while simultaneously talking down a panicked caller and mentoring a trainee. "How do you stay so calm?" the rookie finally asked during a rare quiet moment. Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's not about staying calm," he replied, taking a mindful sip from his water bottle. A habit I'd later learn was one of his intentional, calm anchors. It's about building calm, one small moment at a time. This distinction between staying calm and building calm reveals the essence of what I call sustainable serenity. Most approaches to emotional stability focus on maintaining composure in the moment of stress. But true emotional equilibrium isn't maintained. It's cultivated, like a garden that grows stronger and more resilient with each passing season. Think of emotional stability not as a state to achieve, but as a practice to nurture. Each small moment of intentional calm is like planting a seed that will grow into greater resilience. These micro moments might seem insignificant in isolation, but they compound over time into unshakable composure. Morgan Freeman's journey provides a fascinating example of this principle in action. While many assume his famous composure is simply a natural trait, Freeman has spoken about deliberately cultivating his calm presence throughout his career. In interviews, he's described how early experiences in theater taught him the power of collected energy, the ability to remain centered while expressing intense emotions. What's particularly noteworthy about Freeman's approach is how it deepened over time. Watch his performances chronologically, and you'll notice his composure actually strengthens with age. While many actors become more dramatic as their careers progress, Freeman developed what he calls quiet power, an ability to convey more while doing less. "Every role I take requires intense emotions," Freeman once explained in a masterclass session. "But I discovered that true power comes not from amplifying those emotions, but from remaining centered within them." He achieved this through daily practices so small they might seem trivial, taking 3 conscious breaths before entering a scene, maintaining awareness of his feet on the ground, practicing precise diction, even in casual conversation. The calm cultivation system builds on these insights, offering a structured approach to developing sustainable serenity through daily micro-practices. Rather than trying to force calmness in high-stress moments, this system focuses on planting and nurturing seeds of calm throughout your day. Back at the dispatch center, Thomas demonstrated this approach while training new dispatchers. "See how I touch my desk before answering each call?" he explained to the rookie. "That's not just a habit, it's a calm anchor. Small practices like this create islands of peace that we can bridge between during chaos." Thomas's approach transformed not just his own performance, but the entire unit's culture. Under his leadership, the center's stress-related sick days dropped by 60%, while response effectiveness improved dramatically. The secret wasn't in grand initiatives, but in the accumulation of small, intentional practices. "When I first started," Thomas shared, "I tried to muscle through the stress with pure willpower. But that's like trying to hold back a flood with your bare hands. Now I understand that true calm is built through tiny choices, moment by moment." During one particularly challenging shift, I watched Thomas handle a series of crisis calls that would have overwhelmed most dispatchers. A major accident on the interstate coincided with a warehouse fire and multiple domestic disturbances. Yet Thomas moved through each situation with remarkable equilibrium, his calm presence seeming to expand rather than diminish under pressure. The key, he later explained, wasn't in handling the big moments differently. It was in how he approached the small moments throughout his shift. Each conscious breath, each mindful movement, each moment of intentional presence was like depositing calm into an emotional savings account that he could draw from when needed. This approach to building sustainable serenity represents a fundamental shift from traditional stress management. Instead of treating calm as a limited resource that gets depleted under pressure, it views serenity as a renewable capacity that can actually strengthen through challenge, provided we've planted and nurtured the right seeds. Your challenge for the coming week is to begin your own practice of calm cultivation through the Calm Seeds exercise. Each day, you'll plant 3 tiny seeds of calm, small, intentional practices that take no more than 30 seconds each. These might include taking 1 conscious breath before checking your phone in the morning, feeling your feet on the floor for a moment before starting your car, pausing to notice 3 things you can hear right now. The specific practices matter less than the consistency and intention behind them. Keep a simple note of these moments and how they affect your baseline sense of calm. Notice how these small practices begin to connect and compound over time. Remember, you're not trying to achieve perfect calm. You're cultivating the conditions for serenity to grow naturally. As Thomas would say, the calmest oak in the forest didn't get that way by trying to be calm. It grew that way, one day at a time. How will you begin planting your seeds of serenity today? Chapter 23. Leading with Emotional Intelligence. The tension in the school auditorium was electric. Angry voices echoed off the walls as parents waved protest signs about the controversial new curriculum changes. Security guards shifted nervously, eyeing the growing crowd. But Principal Grace stood calmly at the podium, her presence somehow both gentle and unmovable, like a willow tree in a storm. "I hear your fear," she said softly, yet her voice carried to every corner of the room. The crowd's energy shifted slightly, not quite calming, but listening. "And I want you to know that I share your deep commitment to our children's future." She paused, letting the words settle. What if we could transform this moment from one of confrontation into one of collaboration? In that crucial moment, Grace demonstrated what I call emotional leadership dynamics, the ability to guide others through emotional turbulence by modeling measured response and authentic engagement. This isn't about suppressing emotions or maintaining artificial calm. Rather, it's about channeling emotional energy in ways that elevate everyone in the room. Think of emotional leadership as dropping a stone into still water. The ripples move outward, touching everything in their path. When you maintain composure while acknowledging others' emotions, you create waves of possibility rather than walls of resistance. This is particularly powerful because humans are neurologically wired to mirror the emotional states of those around us, especially authority figures. But there's a crucial distinction between emotional suppression and emotional leadership. True emotional leadership isn't about putting on a mask of false serenity. It's about demonstrating authentic emotional intelligence while creating space for others to find their own emotional equilibrium. Michelle Obama's journey offers a masterclass in this principle. During her time as First Lady, she faced unprecedented levels of personal attacks and racial prejudice. Rather than responding with justified anger or retreating into defensive distance, she transformed these challenges into opportunities for emotional leadership. Consider her famous speech at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. Facing intense political division and personal attacks, she delivered her now iconic line, "When they go low, we go high." But what made this moment truly remarkable wasn't just the words, it was how she embodied them. Her tone carried both strength and warmth, her presence both dignified and approachable. She wasn't just talking about taking the high road, she was modeling exactly how to do it. In her memoir Becoming, Obama revealed how she developed this capacity. "I've had to learn how to channel the very real anger and hurt. I sometimes feel into something more productive, something that could lift others up rather than drag them down." This transformation of personal emotion into leadership presence became a hallmark of her public service. Back at the school board meeting, Grace was demonstrating similar principles. As parents voiced their concerns, some respectfully, others less so, she maintained what I call engaged equilibrium. She listened intently, acknowledged emotions without being swept away by them, and guided the conversation toward constructive solutions. "Your passion shows how much you care about your children's education," she said to one particularly vocal parent. "Let's explore how we can channel that energy into creating something better together." The parent, who moments ago had been shouting, found himself nodding thoughtfully. The leadership response protocol builds on these insights through three key dimensions: personal presence, emotional engagement, and guided growth. Rather than trying to control others' emotions, this approach focuses on creating conditions where better emotional responses can emerge naturally. Grace demonstrated this when she noticed the tension beginning to rise again during discussion of budget allocations. Instead of trying to force calm, she did something unexpected. She asked everyone to stand up. "Let's all take a deep breath together," she suggested. "Remember why we're here. For our children." This simple act shifted the room's energy, not through control, but through connection. Over the following months, Grace's approach created remarkable changes in her school's culture. Teachers began incorporating emotional awareness into their classroom management. Students started practicing peer mediation. Even parents who had been vocal opponents became engaged collaborators in shaping the school's future. The most powerful thing, Grace later reflected, was watching how one person's emotional mastery could inspire others to discover their own. She described watching a student use similar techniques to diffuse a playground conflict, and a teacher transforming a potential parent confrontation into a productive partnership. The real power of emotional leadership lies in this multiplier effect. When you model emotional intelligence in challenging situations, you're not just managing the immediate moment, you're teaching others how to do the same. Each person who learns these skills becomes a new center of positive influence, creating their own ripples of impact. Your challenge for the next week is to practice the Influence Ripple Challenge. Each day, choose one opportunity to demonstrate emotional leadership in a challenging situation. This might be staying calm when someone else is agitated, expressing emotion in a constructive way during conflict, or helping others find their own emotional balance. Document not just what you did, but how it affected those around you. Notice how your emotional state influences others, and how small acts of emotional leadership can create unexpectedly large impacts. Remember Grace's insight. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about creating spaces where better answers can emerge together. The world needs emotional leaders now more than ever. How will you create your ripples of positive influence today? Chapter 24. The Response-Driven Life. The faded photograph showed a younger Marcus Evans, his face contorted with rage, fist clenched around a crumpled quarterly report. "That was me at my breaking point," he told me, tracing the edge of the image with a gentle finger. I thought I was looking at my lowest moment, but it turned out to be the beginning of everything." We sat in his sun-filled office, where that same photo now held a place of honor on his desk, not as a reminder of failure, but as a testament to transformation. The moment captured in that photograph came after Marcus had lost a major client, costing his firm millions. His immediate reaction had been what you'd expect: anger, blame, desperate attempts to salvage the situation. But in the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. "I realized I wasn't just reacting to losing the client," Marcus explained. "I was reacting to a lifetime of letting circumstances dictate my emotional state." This insight marks the foundation of what I call the response-driven philosophy, a comprehensive approach to living that places conscious response at the center of every interaction and decision. It's not just about managing reactions in crisis moments. It's about fundamentally shifting how we engage with life itself. Think about the last time something didn't go your way. Your immediate reaction, whether anger, disappointment, or fear, probably felt automatic, almost predetermined. But what if I told you that this automatic response is actually a choice you've been making unconsciously? What if you could transform every challenge into an opportunity for conscious response? This is where Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson's story becomes particularly illuminating. Long before he became one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, Johnson faced a devastating setback when his dream of professional football came crashing down. Cut from the Canadian Football League after just 2 months, he found himself back in his parents' house with $7 to his name. "I had to make a fundamental choice," Johnson later shared in an interview. "I could either let this failure define me, or I could let it refine me." This distinction, between letting circumstances define us versus using them as tools for refinement, lies at the heart of response-driven living. Johnson's transformation wasn't just about staying positive or working harder. It was about developing what he calls his anchor response, a consistent approach to processing and responding to life's challenges. When he decided to follow his father's footsteps into professional wrestling, he faced ridicule and skepticism. Instead of reacting defensively, he channeled that energy into developing his iconic persona. "Every time someone told me I couldn't make it, I had a choice," Johnson explained. "I could either get angry and defensive, or I could use that doubt as fuel. I chose to make every rejection a reason to prove them wrong, not out of spite, but out of commitment to my own growth." This brings us to the Life Response Reset, a framework for implementing response-driven living across all domains of your existence. It starts with what I call response awareness, developing a keen understanding of your current response patterns. Marcus discovered that his angry reaction to losing the client was actually a pattern that showed up in various forms throughout his life. "I started noticing how I responded similarly to different triggers," Marcus shared. "Whether it was a professional setback, a personal disagreement, or even just traffic, my go-to response was always to tense up, get defensive, and look for someone to blame." This awareness became the foundation for his transformation. The Life Response Reset operates on 3 levels: immediate response, pattern recognition, and life direction. At the immediate level, it's about creating what I call choice points, brief moments of awareness where you can consciously choose your response rather than falling into reactive patterns. Marcus began practicing this during daily irritations, like when his coffee order was wrong or someone cut him off in traffic. At the pattern level, it's about identifying and transforming your recurring response themes. Johnson demonstrated this beautifully in how he handled criticism throughout his career transition from wrestling to acting. Rather than defending himself against those who dismissed him as just a wrestler, he acknowledged their skepticism while remaining committed to his vision. The life direction level is where the real magic happens. This is where conscious response becomes not just a coping mechanism, but a guiding philosophy. Marcus describes this shift. "I stopped seeing life as a series of things happening to me and started seeing it as a series of opportunities to choose my response. That's when everything changed." Conclusion. As I sit here putting the final words to this book, I'm reminded of David from our opening chapter, that overwhelmed manager whose uncontrolled reactions were destroying both his career and marriage. Last week, he sent me an email that perfectly captures what this journey is all about. I used to think mastering my emotions meant suppressing them. Now I understand it's about choosing how to channel them. Every trigger has become an opportunity to practice what I've learned. It's not just about controlling reactions anymore. It's about choosing who I want to become. This transformation lies at the heart of the response gap method. Through this audiobook, you've discovered that the space between trigger and response isn't empty. It's fertile ground for growth. You've learned that awareness isn't just about recognizing your emotions, but about understanding their messages. The pause isn't about freezing, but about creating space for wisdom. Choice isn't about suppression, but about alignment with your values. And strategic response isn't about perfect control, but about purposeful action. Take a moment now to reflect on your journey. Remember that first week when you started tracking your emotional reactions? Perhaps you were surprised by how automatic your responses were, how certain triggers seemed to hijack your best intentions. Now, think about your most recent emotional challenge. Notice how differently you approach these moments. Where you once felt powerless, you now see possibilities. Where reactions once ruled, you now find room for choice. This growth isn't just about personal comfort. It's about thriving in a world that increasingly demands emotional intelligence. In an era where one viral moment can define a reputation, where remote work requires new levels of emotional awareness, and where global challenges test our collective resilience, these skills aren't optional. They're essential. But here's what makes your journey unique. You're not just learning to manage emotions, you're pioneering a new way of living. Every time you create a response gap in a heated moment, every time you choose a thoughtful response over a reactive one, you're not just changing your own experience, you're influencing everyone around you. Think about the ripple effects already in motion. Perhaps your children are learning from your example that emotions can be handled with grace rather than fear. Maybe your colleagues have noticed how your composed presence changes the dynamics of tense meetings. Your relationships might be deepening because you're responding from wisdom rather than reaction. This is just the beginning. The skills you've developed aren't meant to gather dust on a shelf. They're meant to be lived, tested, and refined in the laboratory of daily life. Every emotional trigger is now an invitation to practice. Every challenge is an opportunity to expand your response gap. Remember, emotional mastery isn't about reaching a state of perfect control. It's about engaging with life's challenges from a place of choice rather than compulsion. You'll still feel angry, anxious, or frustrated, but these emotions no longer have the power to hijack your responses. You've developed something more valuable than mere techniques. You've cultivated the ability to choose who you want to become in any given moment. As you end this book and step back into your world, know that you carry with you more than just strategies and techniques. You carry the power of choice. Every emotional challenge you face is now an opportunity to write a new chapter in your story. The question isn't whether triggers will come, they will. The question is, who will you choose to be in those moments? Your new story begins now. Make it one of conscious choice, purposeful response, and continuous growth. The world needs people who can respond rather than react, who can transform triggers into opportunities, who can lead by example in emotionally challenging times. You are now equipped to be one of those people. The next trigger you face isn't just a test. It's your first opportunity to practice this new way of being. How will you choose to respond? Your next chapter awaits. Thank you for listening and for investing in yourself. I believe in you. Your potential is endless. Now, go out there and create the life you deserve.